Chapter 666. Tang Yu looked behind him. Why didn't Aunt Shen come with you? She fell asleep and I didn't wake her up. Oh right, why are you here? Shen Zhongshan asked casually. Tang Yu rubbed his brows. He lowered his head and did not see Shen Zhongshan's expression. When he looked up again, Tang Yu looked tired. Tang Xin has a fever. Shen Zhongshan asked, is she feeling better now? Tang Yu nodded. Her fever has subsided a little, but we still need to observe her. Qing Cheng is inside. Shen Zhongshan pointed downstairs. I still need to get some medicine, you should go back early. He paused for a moment. Chichi is still waiting for you. Tang Yu nodded, said goodbye, and walked towards the elevator. Shen Zhongshan stood there for a while after Tang Yu left. He clenched his fists and looked depressed. Finally, he walked towards the elevator. When he reached Tang Xin's ward, he saw Meng Qingcheng sitting by the bed through the glass. He bent down and kissed Tang Xin. Shen Zhongshan's eyebrows twitched. He could not help but shake hands. Meng Qingcheng, this bastard. How old is Tang Xin? She's only 17, and he kissed her just like that. If there was no one around, if Tang Xin was not sick, would Meng Qingcheng swallow her whole? Although he was a derelict father, he still felt extremely uncomfortable when he saw this scene. Shen Zhongshan coughed lightly. Meng Qingcheng, who was inside, was really shocked. When he straightened his body, Shen Zhongshan walked in. Uncle Shen? Meng Qingcheng was surprised. Shen Zhongshan nodded. I bumped into Tang Yu outside. He said he has a heart disease, so I came to take a look. There was something strange in Meng Qingcheng's eyes. She paused for a while and said, yes, maybe he was too crazy today. Or maybe he scared her. Shen Zhongshan's gaze fell on the little person on the bed. She was small, pale and lifeless. Dr. Yuan's words rang in his ears. Chongshan, you can match her body type, but your body doesn't allow you to. Dr. Yuan and he had been good friends for many years. He did not ask for more details, but from the information provided, he had already guessed it. In B City, what other illness could Shen Zhongshan be so concerned about? When he heard that, he was silent for a long time. Perhaps, Pei Chichi's child could save Tang Xin. At this moment, looking at this small and pale little fellow, it was hard to imagine that she was his daughter. He had seen Tang Xin countless times. She always obediently called him Uncle Shen. She was pretty and obedient. He had always liked her. Privately, he also felt that she was not like Zhao Ku and was a good girl. But the thought that Tang Xin was his child had never crossed his mind. In fact, when Tang Xin was young, he had once carried her in his arms. What would have happened if he had known that it was his child? Meng Qingcheng looked at Shen Zhongshan's expression and felt that he had gone overboard. You've shown concern, haven't you? Uncle Shen, it's okay. It's just a fever. You should be fine tomorrow. It's getting late, you should go home first. Meng Qingcheng said with concern. But now, what Shen Zhongshan did not want the least was Meng Qingcheng's concern, or even jealousy. What right did this kid have to kiss his daughter? Chapter 667. Shen Zhongshan looked at him meaningfully. He took out a list from his pocket and passed it to Meng Qingcheng. Qingcheng, help me get the medicine. Meng Qingcheng opened the list and looked at it. He didn't say anything and walked out. When there was no one around, Shen Zhongshan sat on the bed and looked at Tang Xin. This child had suffered so much since she was born. It was his negligence. Shen Zhongshan reached out and covered Tang Xin with the blanket. His fingers didn't leave the bed immediately. Instead, he touched the pale little thing. His fingertips were hot. She was still having a fever. Tang Xin woke up in a daze. She looked at Shen Zhongshan in the dark. Daddy. She called out in a daze. She mistook him for Tang Jiyuan. That sound was like a kitten. It almost made Shen Zhongshan cry. She called him Daddy. Even though he knew he got the wrong person, he still felt an indescribable feeling in his heart. His eyes were a little warm. He couldn't express his emotions. Tang Xin opened her eyes and closed them again. Daddy, Tang Xin hurts. Every time she had a fever, her body would hurt. That kind of pain was very tiring. That kind of pain scared her. She was afraid that if she fell asleep, she would never wake up again. Shen Zhongshan's heart ached. He didn't know what to say. What a sin. If Zhao Ku was pregnant then, he would have taken good care of her. Would the child not have gotten this disease? But later, Shen Zhongshan found out that this was a hereditary disease in Zhao Ku's family. The incidence was high, but it was rare to have it since birth like Tang Xin. Shen Zhongshan treated Shen Lian like the apple of his eye. But he had never seen such a fragile little thing. Tang Xin was so weak, like a kitten. He reached out and stroked her little head. He comforted her gently. It will get better. Our little Tang Xin will get better. Tang Xin calmed down a little, probably because she felt the warmth. She closed her eyes and did not speak again. Her long eyelashes covered her pale face, making her look as fragile and adorable as a little angel who had fallen to the mortal world. Shen Zhongshan wanted to lean over and kiss her like Meng Qingcheng, but he didn't dare. He was afraid that when Tang Xin woke up, she would look at him as if he was a strange uncle. In the end, he just gently stroked her little head, savoring the memory of her calling him daddy. When Meng Qingcheng came back, Shen Zhongshan looked at the little person on the bed one more time before he left. Outside the hospital, Shen Zhongshan took out another cigarette and slowly smoked it. He unlocked his phone and dialed Dr. Yuan's number. After a while, he said, Dr. Yuan, are you sure my body can't do it? No one knew what Dr. Yuan said, but Shen Zhongshan fell silent. He looked up at the sky and let out a long sigh. Originally, he had planned to donate his bone marrow to Tang Xin in secret, but his heart was not in good condition. Shen Zhongshan let out a long sigh and did not say anything else. He looked at the sky and felt that it was so dark that he almost couldn't breathe. When he reached the car, the driver opened the door for him and said carefully, Sir, Madam just called. Shen Zhongshan sat in the car and closed his eyes. Let's go. The driver drove away. Shen Zhongshan looked at his phone. It was his wife. She had called him 7 or 8 times, but he didn't hear it. Chapter 668. The Shen Mansion's servant replied, Furan did not find teacher and went to play cards. Shen Zhongshan nodded his head, got it. You all can leave. He slowly walked up to the corner of the second floor and bumped into Shen Lian. Shen Lian was shocked for a moment and took a few steps back. Under the light, her face was pale. Shen Zhongshan frowned. What's wrong? Shen Lian's long hair hung loosely over her shoulders and she looked delicate and weak. She looked at him and said softly, Father, nothing. I just can't sleep. Shen Zhongshan paused for a moment before continuing, Sleep early. You still have to work tomorrow. He quietly walked past her and Shen Lian suddenly called out to him, Father, where did you go just now? I heard that you went to the hospital. My stomach is not feeling well. Shen Zhongshan lightly said and turned back to look at Shen Lian, If you can't sleep, don't drink coffee. Got it. Shen Lian watched him leave. She held a medicine bottle in her hand, which was hidden in her sleeve. She stood quietly and listened to Shen Zhongshan enter the bedroom. She knew that he would take the antihypertensive medicine before going to bed. His forehead was full of cold sweat and so were his palms. Shen Lian quickly walked in and Shen Zhongshan was holding the medicine bottle and took out 2 pills. Father. Shen Lian hurriedly called out. Shen Zhongshan lowered his head and looked at her. What's the matter? Shen Lian looked at the medicine in his hand and her face was as white as snow as she bit her lips tightly. Her back was sweating profusely and her pajamas were wet. She just looked at him like that and her gaze was somewhat stiff. Shen Zhongshan did not say anything more as he ate the medicine in his hand and drank a mouthful of water before lightly saying, Sleep early. Shen Lian still looked straight at him and after a long time, she softly said, Father, good night. Shen Zhongshan smiled. The door closed. Shen Lian looked at Shen Zhongshan's silhouette and slowly closed the door. She stood at the door, her body trembling. She laughed, and her laughter was a little desolate. Back in her room, Shen Lian found a cigarette and lit it with trembling hands. She needed to calm down. She couldn't sleep. The moment she closed her eyes, the image of Shen Zhongshan swallowing the pill appeared in front of her. From then on, he would take that medicine every day. She fed the poison with her own hands. In less than half a month, his nerves would be eroded. Perhaps, he would become a vegetable or suffer from dementia, who knows? Shun Lian cried and trembled as she smoked the cigarette in her hand. She didn't want to do this, but he had done a bone marrow match with her mother behind her back. Was he going to donate his bone marrow to Tang Xin? Was he going to give the company to Pei Chichi? Shen Zhongshan started to feel unwell after a week. At that time, he was having a meeting in Jin Taihe. Suddenly, he held his forehead with his hand and looked like he was in pain. Shun Lian stepped forward and asked with concern, "Dad, are you all right?" "I'm fine." Shun Zhongshan waved his hand and struggled to raise his head. "Continue." However, the next second, his body fell straight down. With a loud thud, he fell to the ground together with the chair. "Dad, Dad." Shun Lian rushed over and hugged Shun Zhongshan. She screamed, "Call the ambulance." In the midst of the chaos, Shun Zhongshan was sent to Shengyuan Hospital. It was Dr. Yuan, whom he had always trusted, who examined him. Half an hour later, Dr. Yuan walked out of the examination room with a complicated expression on his face. Mrs. Shun and Shun Lian stepped forward. Mrs. Shun asked anxiously, "How is it?" Chapter 669. Dr. Yuan said calmly, "Be prepared. His nervous system is badly damaged. It's a miracle that he can hold on for so long. And this time, he may never wake up." Mrs. Shun was stunned. She looked at the doctor blankly. Dr. Yuan continued, "We'll do further tests to find out the cause." Mrs. Shun's face was drained of all color. She had completely collapsed. How could Chongshan be like this? Chongshan was a strong man. How could something like this happen to him? She couldn't believe it. Mrs. Shun couldn't face reality. Shun Lian looked at Dr. Yuan and whispered, "Thank you, doctor." Dr. Yuan said seriously, "Should we call the police? I suspect that someone deliberately set Chongshan up." Mrs. Shun was still crying. Shun Lian pursed her lips and said, "It's better not to alert the enemy." Dr. Yuan thought about it and agreed. "Let's wait and see. Maybe a miracle will happen." However, he knew in his heart that it was almost impossible for Shun Zhongshan to recover. That medicinal effect was too strong, too strong. He glanced at Shun Lian's face. Shun Lian pursed her lips and said to Mrs. Shun, "Mom, you stay here. I'll go home and pack my daily necessities." Mrs. Shun wiped her tears and said, "Ask the servants to bring them here. The servants are not so considerate." "I'll go home," Shun Lian said calmly. Mrs. Shun didn't say anything more. Shun Lian nodded at Dr. Yuan and left leisurely. Dr. Yuan and Mrs. Shun stood there. He took out a cigarette from his pocket but didn't light it. He asked Mrs. Shun directly, "Did Chongshan have any conflicts with anyone recently? Or was there anything unusual recently?" "No. Chongshan is a man of propriety. He usually doesn't do things that push people to the brink. I can't think of anyone who would do that." Mrs. Shun covered her face and sighed. "I thought that Chongshan had changed his mind and I would have a good life. I didn't expect such a thing to happen." Dr. Yuan had always been on good terms with the Shun family. He didn't know how to comfort Mrs. Shun. After a few words, a nurse asked him to leave. Mrs. Shun stood alone for a while. At this moment, her mind was blank. Suddenly, she thought of something. Shun Mansion. Shun Lian ran to the master bedroom on the second floor, followed by a servant. "Miss, what's wrong? You can go down. There's nothing else." Shun Lian blocked the stairway and ordered. The servant looked at his miss uneasily. Miss didn't look right. After the servant left, Shun Lian turned around and entered Shun Zhongshan's study. She keyed in a few passwords and found the DNA certificate in the safe. She looked at it for a while and sneered. She lit a fire and burned the document. From now on, no one would know that her father was also Pei Chichi and Tang Xin's father. Jin Taihe would not fall into the hands of others. After it was burnt to ashes, Shun Lian quietly looked at it for a while, and then changed Shun Zhongshan's medicine. She erased her fingerprints and put the real medicine back. As for the problematic medicine, she held it in her hand and wanted to flush it down the toilet in the bathroom. But when she turned around, she saw Mrs. Shen. Chapter 670. Shen Lian's lips trembled. Unable to speak, she could only clench the bottle in her hand. Mrs. Shen's eyes were filled with tears. She glared at her daughter and asked, "Shen Lian, what are you holding in your hand?" Shen Lian took a step back. Her body was pressed against the wall behind her. She had nowhere to go and said in a trembling voice, "Mom, it's nothing. Why did you come back?" "Yes, if I hadn't come back, I would never have known that your father and I had raised an ingrate." Mrs. Shen was like a ferocious mother beast with claws all over her body. Shen Lian's facial muscles were trembling. Suddenly, she screamed, "Mom, what are you saying?" Mrs. Shen took a step forward. Her fingers were like pliers, grabbing Shen Lian's hand and raising it high. She raised the bottle high. "Do you dare to say that there's nothing in it?" Mrs. Shen dragged her all the way to the bedside where Shen Chongshan was sleeping. She picked up the bottle and said, "Shen Lian, if you didn't do it, who did it?" "Her." The last sound was like the roar of a mother beast that had lost its love. Shen Lian stared blankly at the two medicine bottles rolling down again and again. Tears fell like raindrops. Her voice was choked with sobs. "Yes, I did it." Just as she finished speaking, she received a slap on her face. Then another slap. Mrs. Shen was usually gentle and weak. But at this moment, her palms were like iron plates. She slapped Shen Lian's face again and again. Shen Lian did not resist. She let Mrs. Shen hit her until her face was swollen. Mrs. Shen cried hoarsely as she hit her, "What's wrong with you? He's your father. You hurt him like this. Aren't you afraid that God will punish you?" Shen Lian let her hit her. Mrs. Shen was on the verge of breaking down. Her child had harmed her husband. The sky of her world was about to collapse. She hit her and howled. Tears streamed down her face. Shen Lian finally raised her eyes and looked at her mother, who was almost crazy. "Mom, are you going to allow his betrayal?" Mrs. Shen was stunned. She stopped and looked at her daughter in a daze. She said in a daze, "So, just because of this, you want to harm him?" "Mom, wake up." Shen Lian was in a sorry state. She looked at her mother and said, "Do you think he just slept with Zhao Ku?" Mrs. Shen slapped him again. "Do you know what you're saying?" Shen Lian's face was slapped to the side. She covered her face and chuckled softly. She then raised her eyes and looked at Mrs. Shen with a pitiful gaze. "Mom, are you really satisfied with this kind of marriage? Do you know how many things he's kept from you?" Mrs. Shen's lips were trembling, and she couldn't say a word. Shen Lian sneered, "You probably don't know this, but Pei Chichi and Tang Xin are his and Zhao Ku's illegitimate children." Mrs. Shen was stunned. Pei Ming and Tang Jiyuan are both happy to be fathers. They were so stupid to raise a daughter for Shen Zhongshan. "Mom, now he wants to acknowledge these two illegitimate children. Maybe he will even hand the company over to Pei Chichi." Shen Lian laughed so hard that she was about to cry. "Mom, think about it. If Pei Chichi inherits the company, where will we stand? Where will you, Mrs. Shen, stand?" Mrs. Shen's eyes were filled with disbelief. She just wanted to take back what belonged to her. Shen Zhongshan had betrayed his family, and this was what he deserved. She had given him a chance, but he had insisted on matching Tang Xin. Don't blame her. At Shengyuan Hospital. Tang Xin stayed in the hospital for more than 10 days before she was discharged. One night, she went out to look at the stars. Although Meng Qingcheng accompanied her and put on extra clothes for her, she still caught a cold. The day before she was discharged, Pei Chichi happened to have a prenatal checkup and came to accompany Tang Xin. At that time, Meng Qingcheng was in the small kitchen, squeezing a glass of apple juice for Tang Xin. Chapter 672. Pei Chichi sat there and glanced at Meng Qingcheng's back view. She patted Tang Xin's little head and said in a low voice, "Qingcheng treats you well. You've been taking care of you in the hospital for more than 10 days, and you're not annoyed at all." Tang Xin, who was wearing a hospital gown, also glanced over and snorted. "Even if he doesn't find it annoying, I find it annoying. But when she said this, she always had the softness of a little girl. Pei Chichi just smiled. At this moment, Meng Qingcheng walked out and heard what Tang Xin said. He sighed. If you say that, I'll be sad. Tang Xin took the glass of fruit juice from his hand and stuck out her tongue. You won't. You have an indestructible body. Meng Qingcheng didn't reply and just looked at her deeply. He was indeed not bad to others, but Tang Xin was the softest part of his heart. He wasn't so firm towards her from the start, and he couldn't do without her. After seeing so many people, his heart felt empty. He always felt that having a little girl was the best. But he didn't know if she knew how he felt. Tang Xin knew. Otherwise, why would she be willing to be taken care of by him for more than 10 days? Why would she be willing to lean on his shoulder and look at the stars? It wasn't that she liked him now, but she didn't want him to be sad. Brother Qingcheng liked her. She thought that she might not live for so long, so she should let him be happy. They each had their own thoughts, but they didn't say it out loud because she was too young. Pei Chichi watched from the side. Slowly, she felt that she was a little unnecessary, and Tang Yu was talking to Director Hao. After she left, she wanted to walk around when she saw Tang Yu walking over. He didn't look well. Pei Chichi walked over slowly and hugged his arm. What's wrong? Tang Yu lowered his head, his voice a little hoarse. Uncle Shen isn't doing well. He was admitted to the hospital last time, and now it's basically confirmed that he has dementia in advance. Pei Chichi was stunned. How could that be? She had seen Shen Zhongshan a few days ago, and he looked fine. How did he get that kind of illness? Tang Yu didn't say anything more, but his mood was a little heavy. No matter how unpleasant the past was between him and Shen Lian, Shen Zhongshan was still an elder that he respected. His circumstances made him sigh. He patted Pei Chichi's hand. Let's go take a look. Pei Chichi nodded and walked with him to the inpatient department on the 2nd floor. There was no one else in Shen Zhongshan's ward except for the 2 nurses and himself. Sitting on the bed without any expression, there was a small plate in his hand with cut fruits on it. Shen Zhongshan was putting the fruits into his mouth piece by piece. The nurse wiped his mouth from time to time. This was the Shen Zhongshan that Tang Yu had never seen before. He couldn't help but sigh. Shen Zhongshan quickly finished the food on the plate and looked straight at the nurse. Big sister, I want more. The nurse lowered her head and said something, and Shen Zhongshan laughed. Pei Chichi almost couldn't bear to watch anymore. She couldn't believe that this was Shen Zhongshan, the dignified Shen Zhongshan. Tang Yu didn't go up to greet him. After they walked out of the door, Pei Chichi asked him. He held her little hand and walked forward slowly. After a long time, he said softly, I just don't want to disturb his world. Chapter 673. Pei Chichi hugged his arm and stroked her belly with one hand. What about Mrs. Shen? Why isn't she around? Tang Yu patted her and said, I heard from Dr. Yuan that Mrs. Shen's body suddenly collapsed. She has been on an 4 drip at home these days and can't even walk. Pei Chichi stood still and looked up at Tang Yu. Her eyes were watery. Chichi, I won't do this. Tang Yu held her hand tightly and pulled her into his arms. He said softly, I will always take good care of our child. She buried her face in his arms and breathed in his warm breath. After a while, she said in a muffled voice, Tang Yu, I actually feel sad when I look at him. He was obviously an unrelated person and he was Shen Lian's father. But looking at his face and hearing him say naive words that didn't match his status, Pei Chichi's heart twitched violently. It was a strange feeling that she couldn't explain. Tang Yu reached out and patted her. He murmured softly, it's probably because she's pregnant. She gets emotional easily. He was starting to regret bringing her along. Pei Chichi walked to the elevator and couldn't help but turn back. When she turned back, Shen Zhongshan's nurse happened to push him out to bask in the sun. Shen Zhongshan was sitting in a wheelchair and in front of him was a little scarf that a child used to eat. Pei Chichi's eyes felt a little warm as she looked at it. Her heart was hit hard again, and her lower abdomen was twitching violently. She held her lower abdomen with her fingers and had a strange expression on her face. Chichi. Tang Yu hugged her. What's wrong? Pei Chichi looked up at him and the corners of her lips moved. After a while, she said softly, Tang Yu, it seems that the baby is moving. She held his warm palm and placed it on her lower abdomen, letting him feel the magic. Tang Yu only felt that there was a slight movement in his palm. That power was as gentle as water, his eyes were a little moist and his expression was emotional. He gently embraced Pei Chichi. Thank you, Chichi. She buried her head in his shoulder and saw Shen Zhongshan walking past them. Shen Zhongshan had a childish smile on his face. Pei Chichi leaned on Tang Yu's shoulder. Her eyes were filled with tears, and she said in a nasal voice, Tang Yu, I feel so sorry for him. Tang Yu patted her. Don't think too much. It will only make you sad. Shen Zhongshan passed by. Suddenly, he turned his head and smiled at Pei Chichi. Miss Pei Chichi was startled. After a while, she returned a smile. For some reason, Shen Zhongshan refused to move forward. His fingers were stuck on the wheelchair, preventing it from being pushed. The nurse turned around and smiled. Mr. Shen likes Mrs. Tang very much. Pei Chichi broke free from Tang Yu and walked gently to Shen Zhongshan. He looked up at her and shook his head gently. He looked no different from a 4 or 5-year-old child. Pei Chichi slowly squatted down and held Shen Zhongshan's hand. She touched his little finger. You have to listen to me. Shen Zhongshan smiled and repeated the words. Pei Chichi's eyes were a little wet. She smiled and said, I'll come to see you next time, okay? Shen Zhongshan stared at her, as if he was trying to remember her in his mind. Before leaving, Pei Chichi looked at Tang Yu and said in a low voice, I'm really sad that such a person became a child. Chapter 674. As the car slowly started, Pei Chichi couldn't help but look at the building again. Tang Yu thought that she was worried about Tang Xin, so he patted her head and said, she will be discharged tomorrow. Don't worry. Pei Chichi looked at the blazing sun in front of him, shining with golden light. She pursed her lips and didn't tell Tang Yu that she was sad to see Shen Zhongshan like that. She was afraid that if she told him, he would say that she was sentimental because she was pregnant. In the quiet car, she leaned on his shoulder. Peace, peace. After the summit of B City's high-end enterprises, Tang Yu was about to get into the car when he heard a female voice behind him. He turned around and saw Shen Lian. She was wearing Issey Miyoke's white suit, elegant as an orchid, and walked quickly to Tang Yu. Mr. Shen, what's the matter? Tang Yu was about to open the car door and had to deal with it. He looked around and saw that many of the business elites he knew had left. Perhaps they were idle, but they would also look over to gossip. Shen Lian looked up at him. Tang Yu had been married for almost 2 months. Time did not leave any mark on him, but he looked more mature and exuded a noble aura, which was like a poison that attracted women. Tang Yu, let's have dinner together, Shen Lian said humbly. I have something to discuss with you about my father's condition. Tang Yu looked at her for a long time and said in a low voice, if you have any questions about Uncle Shen, you can ask Director Hao or Dr. Yuan. Dr. Yuan is Uncle Shen's best friend, and I think he will do his best. Then, he nodded slightly and said, I still have something to do, so we can skip the dinner. He opened the car door and got into the car, buckled the seatbelt, and the car window slowly rolled up. Shen Lian watched his car drive away without any reluctance, and her fingers clenched. She had just helped Jin Taihe win a few big projects and was in the limelight. She thought that Tang Yu would at least look at her. She was much stronger than Pei Chichi, a woman who only knew how to use despicable means. Other than scheming, what else could Pei Chichi do? However, Tang Yu didn't even look at her and left just like that. Shen Lian stood there in a daze, feeling the malice of the whole world. Why? Why didn't he look at her again? Why did Pei Chichi hold his gaze so firmly? Why? Frustrated, Shen Lian began to loiter in bars again. During the day, she was the high and mighty President Shen of a multinational company. At night, she was the queen of the bar. She led a befuddled life because no one cared about her anymore. Shen Zhongshan was a fool. Even if he wasn't a fool, he probably didn't care about her. Instead, he wanted to tear this unfilial daughter of his apart. Her mother ignored her, didn't talk to her, didn't look at her, and didn't even eat with her. She had nothing left. Wearing a black see-through dress, Shun Lian leaned against the seat of the bar and looked at the men in front of her. Her eyes were hazy from drunkenness. "Tonight, I will belong to whoever drinks the most," she smiled charmingly, but her eyes were empty. She felt that she was actually a walking corpse. The men in front of her were all trying to please her. Other than her body, there was also her money. After the matter, she would give these men a tip, because she was the queen, and these cheap men were out to sell themselves. Chapter 675. This was the scene that Qin Anlan saw when he walked into the bar. Shun Lian was kissing a man, and the people around them were clapping and cheering. After the man finished kissing, he immediately drank a large glass of brandy, and the last sip was shared with Shun Lian. The golden liquor slowly flowed down her chin, down her neck, and even her collar. The man put Shun Lian's entire body on the table, held her hand, and licked the liquor clean from top to bottom. Qin Anlan watched quietly. After a while, he took out a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and took a puff. He was still looking at Shun Lian. Until she discovered his existence. Shun Lian's pupils shrank. She stared at Qin Anlan, and then she quickly pushed the man away. "Did you have fun?" Qin Anlan smiled faintly as he looked at Shun Lian. In his eyes, she was no longer a high and mighty queen, but a prostitute of the lowest status. Shun Lian stood up and reached out to brush her long wavy hair. Her voice was a little cold. "What are you doing here? Are you here to laugh at me?" Qin Anlan sneered. "President Shun is riding the crest of success now. How can you laugh at me?" As he said that, he walked over. President Qin had his own aura. The men who were trying to seduce him naturally knew that he was a big shot, so they took the initiative to retreat. There were only the two of them here. The most ironic thing was that this corner was only a few meters away from the place where they had made love the last time. That night, when Shun Lian cried and told him, "Qin Anlan, let's be together," he really hesitated. Qin Anlan flicked the ash off his cigarette and smiled. Fortunately, he didn't take it seriously that night. Shun Lian also sat down, brushed her hair, and said indifferently, "Why are you free tonight?" Or, her voice was a little hoarse. "Or do you have time to accompany me?" Qin Anlan held a cigarette and looked deeply into her eyes. After a while, he chuckled, "I'm not one of your little wolf dogs." His body leaned forward slightly and he seemed a little devilish. "Shun Lian, I'm not used to driving public transport." Although he didn't have a virgin complex, he wasn't interested in such a messy woman. She slept next to one man tonight and slept in another man's bed tomorrow. As soon as he said that, Shun Lian raised her hand angrily, wanting to slap him. She raised her hand, but Qin Anlan reached out and grabbed it. His grip was so strong that it hurt her. "Shun Lian, go ahead and ruin yourself. Look at yourself when you're free. Do you think Tang Yu will still want you like this?" Qin Anlan let go of her hand, got up, and patted the wrinkles on his body. "Let me give you a piece of advice. Men and women are different. It doesn't matter how many women a man has experienced before marriage. It's different for a woman. If you're sure you want to continue like this, no one can control you. But think about your name. See if you're worthy." Shun Lian was stunned. Qin Anlan had already left. She thought he would leave, that he had appeared tonight for her. But she was wrong again. Qin Anlan walked to the other side and was quickly surrounded by a beauty. He didn't reject her. He kissed her passionately, caressed her, and then left. Shun Lian took a photo and the next day it was published in the newspapers. The headline was "King Entertainment's CEO meets a beauty at night." Chapter 676. When she returned home late at night, she was wearing a pair of 7-inch high heels. She did not drive, nor did she hail a cab. Instead, she squatted by the roadside and threw up. A boorish man who passed by the roadside whistled at her. Shun Lian stood in the night breeze. "Are you crazy?" She had just finished scolding when the man's eyes shone with a green light, filled with greed and lust. The man was dressed crudely. His face was covered with a beard and his hair was long and curly. He looked dirty. His eyes scanned Shun Lian's body from head to toe like a radar. The green light became even more intense. Especially this woman's fair and tender skin, it suited his taste very well. She was so drunk, and she was at the entrance of a bar. It would be a waste if he did not do it. The uncouth man ran forward, grabbed her, and dragged her into the alley, muttering dirty words as he desperately and hurriedly rubbed her. "Let go of me, you crazy man." Shun Lian was hugged from behind, and that person was kissing her neck. She could even smell a stinky breath. That person's hands were extremely rough, and the smell on his body was also very unpleasant. She punched and kicked him. One of her shoes fell off, and her delicate feet were scraped on the ground. She cried and screamed, but nothing could stop the man. Late at night in B City, especially in such an area, there was no one around. Shun Lian's body was pressed against the wall. The rough wall scraped her back, and it was burning hot. But no matter how painful it was not as painful as the humiliation. The boorish man said dirty words as he took advantage of her. That black and white, that foul smell, became Shun Lian's nightmare for the rest of her life. Her forehead was covered in sweat. That stinky mouth, a mouth full of yellow teeth, and those green eyes were in front of her. At the last moment, Shun Lian's body slipped and she sat on the ground. The man in front of her did not seem to be willing to let it end just like that. He had never touched a woman who was as soft as tofu, and it was free. However, the homeless man in his 50s had the will but not the strength. He tried to struggle again, but to no avail. After cursing for a while, he bent down to pick up Shun Lian's purse, took out all the cash from the wallet inside, and lowered his head to rub his foot against Shun Lian's body. Shun Lian vomited and shouted weakly, "I'm going to kill you." The man grinned, revealing his yellow teeth. "I'm not afraid. Women like you are the most prideful. Why don't you sue me? It just so happens that I don't have a house to live in, so I can live here for free. But when I come out, I'll make you feel good." This kind of woman was the best at pretending to be serious. He was clearly feeling good just now, but he pretended that he didn't feel anything. Bit. The man took the money and left quickly, leaving Shun Lian there, unable to get up for a long time. She was there, torn apart. That was because the man came straight at her without giving her any time to react. But even though it was so painful, she still reached her limit in the end. This was the most shameful thing in Shun Lian's life. It was a pain that she was unable to speak of. She swore that she must find that man and dismember his body into 10,000 pieces. When she returned to the Shun mansion, it was already late at night. Unexpectedly, Shun Furen was not asleep. Under the light, Shun Furen's face was somewhat stiff. She looked at Shun Lian and that torn clothes, which was neither human nor ghost. Shun Furen frowned and did not say anything. Chapter 677. Shun Lian screamed at Mrs. Shun, "Mom, why don't you care about me? Aren't you going to ask me what happened?" Mrs. Shun didn't say anything. She just sat there. She looked at the TV, which was showing a palace drama, The Inheritance War. She murmured to herself, "How cruel." She even killed her own father and brother. She didn't seem to feel anything. She just looked at the TV and murmured to herself. Shun Lian's entire body was cold. She slowly walked over. The skin on her feet was already broken, and every step was painful. She turned off the TV. There was no sound at all. After that, there was dead silence. Shun Lian stood between the television and Mrs. Shun. Her entire face was covered in sweat and dirt. Her voice was dry and hoarse. "Mom, I've been raped." Mrs. Shun was still sitting there. She didn't show much reaction on her face. After a long time, she raised her eyes and looked at Shun Lian blankly. "Your father should take his medicine. I'll go get it for him. I can't take the wrong medicine again." Mrs. Shun said to herself as she walked, "You can't take the wrong medicine again. Chongshan, I will watch you carefully. This time, you won't take the wrong medicine." She kept talking and walked upstairs slowly. She didn't look at Shun Lian at all. Later, Shun Lian found out that Mrs. Shun was in a trance. She was not normal. She was sometimes good and sometimes bad. At this time, Shun Lian watched Mrs. Shun go upstairs. Her whole body was trembling. She had been raped, but her mother didn't seem to hear it. In her heart, there was only Shen Chongshan. Shen Chongshan. No one cared about her. Shun Lian's hands were trembling. She took out the medicine from her bag. It was the morning after medicine. She swallowed it raw. She drank water, and swallowed it with tears. Half a month later, the homeless man was found. Shun Lian ordered someone to kill him. In the end, his legs were broken. But the man was very tough. He ran away and was never found again. Until later, but that man left a deep scar in Shun Lian's heart and body. That mouthful of yellow teeth and the rancid odor emanating from his body couldn't be dispersed. When she slowly calmed down, she ran into Tang Yu and Pei Chichi in the hospital. Pei Chichi's belly could already be seen. The weather was hot in August, and Pei Chichi was wearing a loose white dress. Her long hair was tied into a ponytail. Other than her belly, her arms and legs were slim, and she looked very girlish. Tang Yu held her hand. From behind, one couldn't tell that Pei Chichi was pregnant at all. It was like holding a little girl's hand. Just by looking at her, Shun Lian could see how much Tang Yu doted on that woman. That love was supposed to be hers. Her eyes seemed to be on fire as she looked at him. After a long time, she walked into Shen Zhongshan's ward. Shen Zhongshan was eating. He was like a child now. He loved to eat. He wanted to eat all day long. If the nurse hadn't stopped him, he would have been fat. Shun Lian went in and closed the door. She looked at him quietly for a while. The nurse coaxed Shen Zhongshan to eat an apple. When she saw Shun Lian, she smiled. "Miss Shen, you're here." Shun Lian hadn't visited Shen Zhongshan for a long time. Because of her guilty conscience, fear, and avoidance. She nodded and said softly to the nurse, "You can leave. I want to accompany Dad." The nurse hesitated for a while but still left. Chapter 678. Shun Zhongshan's gaze landed on her face and he only said one word, "Eat." Shun Lian looked at him and placed the fruits that the nurse had placed in front of Shun Zhongshan. "Eat." Shun Zhongshan did not move. He only raised his head and looked at Shun Lian with a hint of helplessness in his eyes. This was Shun Zhongshan, the Shun Zhongshan who used to be so famous in B City. Who didn't know him? But now, it had become like this. Shun Lian sneered, "Why aren't you eating?" She moved her face closer to him and said in a cold voice, "Dad, are you afraid that I'll hurt you?" Shun Zhongshan's body moved backward and he lowered his head. After a long time, he said, "No." He lowered his head so that Shun Lian could not see his expression. She only felt angry. She grabbed his head with one hand and held his face. She stuffed the fruits into Shun Zhongshan's mouth with all her might. "Don't you want to eat? Then eat as much as you want." Shun Zhongshan moved a few times and stopped moving. Then, he began to eat the fruits in her hands. As he chewed, the juice flowed out of his mouth. He looked extremely pathetic. The Shun Zhongshan in the past would never be like this. "You really have dementia." Shun Lian stopped and looked at her father coldly. "Do you know why? Because you're not a good father." Shun Lian's eyes were watery. "You've already let Zhao Ku and Pei Chichi and Tang Xin down. Why do you have to let me and Mom down as well?" As she spoke, she walked around the bed and looked at the man who only cared about eating. "Pei Chichi married Tang Yu and you started to match Tang Xin's type. Did your heart soften? Do you feel guilty for what you did to your two daughters?" Shun Lian's smile was strange. "Dad, I'm so afraid. I'm afraid that you'll soften and give Jin Taihe to someone else. That would be worse than death for me. I've given in to Tang Yu and Dad. Do I still have to give in to the company?" Shun Lian bent down and placed a mango on top of Shun Zhongshan's head. Immediately, a yellow juice flowed down his head, covering his entire face. "So, I can't let you have a good time, Dad. Isn't it good like this? Our family of 3 will always be together, and there won't be any lowly daughter coming to destroy us." Shun Lian stared into his eyes and smiled sinisterly. Shun Zhongshan's mouth was wide open, and he couldn't say anything for a long time. He dipped his finger into the mango juice and put it in his mouth. He ate it carefully and savored it. His face was as happy as a child's. Delicious. Even Shen Lian was stunned. Right now, Shen Zhongshan was just a child. She looked at his face and sneered, "Dad, if you can't recover after 5 years, I will inherit your shares and take back Tang Yu. Just you wait and see. Who is better, Pei Chichi or me, Shen Lian?" As she said that, the door of the ward opened. Shen Lian turned around and saw Mrs. Shen standing at the door, looking at them coldly. Shen Lian's lips moved. "Mom." Mrs. Shen walked in and still didn't look at her. She only scolded in a low voice, "Bastard." Then, she carefully cleaned the mango on Shen Zhongshan's head and coaxed him in a low voice, "Zhongshan, let's go take a shower, okay?" Shen Zhongshan obviously didn't want to. Mrs. Shen coaxed him in a low voice, "I brought a duckling over today. It can squawk." She took out a duckling from her bag and pressed it, making a squawking sound. Shen Zhongshan clapped his hands and immediately said that he wanted to take a bath. Mrs. Shen pushed him to the bathroom and didn't look at the bastard again. That night, the servants moved Mrs. Shen's things away. When Shen Lian asked, she found out that they were moving to another property, which wasn't as big as this one. Chapter 679. Ever since the first fetal movement, Pei Chichi's belly had been very active every day. That child was especially active. Every day, he liked to kick and punch the ground with his little fist. Moreover, Pei Chichi had become very lazy and didn't like to move. She went to the company 3 times a week, and the rest of the time, Xiaowen would send her over and she would deal with it at home. Early in the morning, Tang Yu had already put on his tie. He bent down and kissed her cheek. His voice was a little hoarse. "Mrs. Tang, do you want Mr. Tang to send you today?" Pei Chichi hugged the quilt. Her hair was messy, and she looked like a little crazy. Her voice was soft and coquettish. "Tang Yu, I don't want to get up." She said that, which meant that she was going to the company today, but the little lazy worm didn't want to get up. Tang Yu chuckled, sat down, and reached out to touch her little head. "Then don't go. Rest at home with the baby." He thought unkindly that it was good for Pei Enterprises to collapse. She didn't have to go to work. But he couldn't tell his Pei Chichi about this. Otherwise, she would probably bite him to death. Well, pregnant women were very difficult to serve, in all aspects. For example, in that area. He didn't know if she was pregnant, but she was very clingy and always wanted him to hug her. He didn't dare to touch her. Hugging her to sleep was also a challenge for a hot-blooded man like Tang Yu. She was 4 months pregnant, and her lower abdomen was slightly protruding. In front, it looked like a little frog with 4 slender legs, but in the back, it was even more charming, especially below the waistline, which was much more voluptuous. This was the difference between hugging a girl and hugging a woman. Tang Yu, who had been abstinent for a long time, hugged her, pushed her messy hair aside, and kissed her. Then he said in a low voice, "I'll feed you tonight." In fact, she was uncomfortable, but he was even more uncomfortable. Pei Chichi blushed and looked at him. I don't want that." He smiled and pinched her. "Get up, or I'll change for you." "Huh." As he said that, he put his big hand into the quilt. Pei Chichi screamed, and her little face was red. "No." She grabbed his fingers under the quilt and leaned into his arms like a rascal. She said softly, "I have something urgent to do later." Tang Yu was actually just teasing her, but now he wanted to do it for real. He couldn't even remember when was the last time he tasted meat. He exhaled with difficulty and said in a hoarse voice, "I'll let you go." However, he still kissed her all over before he let her go. Looking at her intoxicated expression, Mr. Tang was very satisfied. Mrs. Tang, Mr. Tang has a great sense of achievement. Pei Chichi bit him and didn't let go. Tang Yu allowed her to do as she pleased. After a while, he said in a low voice, "Chichi, if you continue like this, I might not be able to take it anymore." She finally let go. She lay on his shoulder for a while, and her little hands hugged his neck. She was indescribably cute. At this time, Tang Yu was in the mood to raise a daughter, and all the messy thoughts from before were gone. Naughty little girl. Reaching out, he patted her butt and exhaled. He carried her to the bathroom and personally helped his little friend wash her face and brush her teeth. Chapter 680. Looking at the pregnant woman in the mirror, Mr. Tang was amused. Pei Chichi, don't you think you're spoiled? Fine, she admitted it. Mrs. Tang Jr. stuck to him and put the toothbrush in his hand. Tang Yu was speechless. She was really spoiled. However, he still took the toothbrush and brushed her teeth gently. He asked Pei Chichi in a very gentle voice, "Baby, let me carry you to the bathroom. I'll wipe your teeth later." Pei Chichi covered her eyes. "Tang Yu, you're a pervert." He put one hand on her belly and the other on her waist. Looking at the two of them in the mirror, he said slowly, "Mrs. Tang, if you weren't pregnant, you would know how perverted I am." Pei Chichi opened her eyes and saw his clear black eyes in the mirror. Whenever he looked like this, it meant he was about to do something bad. She quickly covered her eyes again. Tang Yu teased her in a low voice, "Hurry up and get changed. I'll wait for you downstairs." He let go of her and Pei Chichi glanced at him in the mirror. Tang Yu smiled and went downstairs. Breakfast was a pleasant one. Mr. Tang, who was dissatisfied, still served Mrs. Tang well. When they got in the car, she automatically sat in the back. Since she was pregnant, Tang Yu didn't let her sit in the front. Tang Yu drove and occasionally talked to Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi was a little bored and read the newspaper in the car. She liked to read entertainment news. She saw the news about Pei Huan in the headlines. It was hard for her. She was not even a 4th or 5th A-lister, but she was in the headlines. Of course, it was also because of his flirtatious relationship with a certain rich second-generation heir that he was able to rise to the top. Pei Chichi also found out that Pei Huan had been doing well recently. Although he couldn't be compared to before, he could be considered to be standing in the entertainment industry again. How much effort did she put in and how many men she slept with, Pei Chichi did not know. Was this the life that Pei Huan wanted? She used to think that Pei Huan loved Jinrong and would find a way to save Jinrong after he woke up, but she didn't. Pei Huan was still the same. Perhaps, even she herself had given up on herself. "What are you looking at? You haven't spoken for a long time," Tang Yu asked in a low voice as he looked at his little friend in the rearview mirror. Pei Chichi closed the newspaper and said softly, "It's Pei Huan. She seems to be with a rich second generation recently." Tang Yu seemed to know what she was thinking, and it happened to be a red light. He rubbed his chin with his fingers and said faintly, "Jinrong can't be with her. They don't have any feelings, and they don't have a child. Besides, Pei Huan has been with so many men. Jinrong is not a fool." "I know." Pei Chichi looked down. Tang Yu did not say anything else. When the car stopped at the Pei Corporation's building, he opened the door for her and reached out to rub her hair. "You think too much, little friend. Pei Huan is not a child anymore. She has to be responsible for the path she has chosen. Pei Huan had a chance. She had already stepped into a rich family and was even pregnant. Even if Jinrong became a vegetable at that time, as long as she was willing to give birth to the child, the Lin family would not mistreat her. After all, that was the only root of the Lin family. Moreover, after giving birth, it wasn't like she couldn't remarry. It wasn't the past anymore. Chapter 681. Pei Chichi nodded and looked up, "Then pick me up in the afternoon. Come at noon. I have something to do nearby." He pinched her little face again. "My little cow must be obedient." Pei Chichi's face turned red. When did she become a little cow again? But she soon remembered that Tang Yu held her hand last night and said slowly, "Pei Chichi, you seem to have grown up." She stared at him shamelessly. Tang Yu smiled and was about to get into the car when he saw something flashing in the corner of his eyes. "Pei Chichi, you bitch, you made our Pei Huan so miserable. I'm going to destroy you." A very childish female voice was heard, and then, before Pei Chichi could react, she was swept into a warm embrace, and then she heard a painful moan. She opened her eyes and saw a girl in her early 20s lying on the ground. Half of her arm was charred, and there was a pungent smell. It was Lucia. Pei Chichi was stunned. At this time, several security guards ran over and pressed the girl on the ground. Of course, they also took away the remaining half of the bottle on the ground. The girl covered her face and screamed. She looked very pitiful on the ground. Call the police and send her to the hospital. Pei Chichi was slightly trembling in Tang Yu's arms. She saw that the girl's face was also charred. She was probably disfigured. Tang Yu gestured for the security guards to do it, and he helped Pei Chichi in. But after 2 steps, Pei Chichi stopped. Her face was a little pale, and her lips were completely devoid of blood. Tang Yu said in a low voice, "Chichi." Pei Chichi's forehead was full of sweat, and her little hand grabbed Tang Yu tightly. "Tang Yu, send me to the hospital." The child. She lowered her head and looked below her. She was wearing a white dress, and there was a bright red stain on it. It was dyed red and stung her eyes. She was in so much pain that her nails dug deep into Tang Yu's flesh. Her pale lips pursed again and again as she endured the pain. "Tang Yu. Tang Yu, I can't lose this child." This child was not only Tang Xin's hope, it was also the child she had been waiting for. It was the fruit of her and Tang Yu's labor. In just over 5 months, they would be parents. She was terrified that she might not be able to keep the baby. "Chichi, don't speak." Tang Yu's eyes were a little red. He had already picked her up and carefully placed her on the back seat. At this time, Xiao Wen also rushed over and sat in the car. "Don't worry, Mr. Tang. I'll take care of him from behind." Tang Yu nodded and immediately jumped into the car. He took Pei Chichi to the nearest hospital as fast as he could. His mind was in a mess, but he forced himself to calm down. Just as Chichi said, nothing could happen to this child. Slowly, he calmed down and said in a low voice, "Chichi, nothing will happen to the child. I promise you." Pei Chichi's forehead was still covered in cold sweat. She felt waves of pain in her lower abdomen. It was very painful, but when she heard Tang Yu's voice, she slowly calmed down. If he said nothing would happen, she would believe that the child would be safe. "Tang Yu." She called his name. At this time, she only felt at ease when he was by her side. Xiao Wen hugged her, feeling anxious. However, she did not dare to show it, for fear that President Pei would overthink. Chapter 682. In the end, they still went to Shengyuan Hospital. In the car, Tang Yu threw his phone to Xiao Wen and asked her to contact him. Xiao Wen's voice trembled as she spoke. Soon, doctors and emergency treatment were arranged. When they arrived at the hospital, Tang Yu carried Pei Chichi to the emergency room. She was lying on the white hospital bed with a pale face. Tang Yu's body was also stained with her blood. He bent down and placed his hands on both sides of her head. His face was close to hers, and his lips were near her ears. "Chichi, the child will be fine. Bear with it." His heart ached for her, but he knew that nothing could happen to the child. His Chichi was strong, but he couldn't imagine what would happen to the child without her. Pei Chichi closed her eyes. She had already lost her strength and voice from the pain. She just slowly moved her fingers and held Tang Yu's hand tightly. Then, she let go. Dr. Mai rushed over and helped push the door in. She glanced at Tang Yu and said, "Wait outside. Nothing will happen." She saw that Tang Yu's eyes were red. This child had never been so fragile before. "Auntie Mai, please." Tang Yu's eyes were a little hot as he raised his head. "Chichi is very important to me." Auntie Mai understood the meaning behind his words. No matter what, this child was not as important as Pei Chichi. She nodded and said, "I understand." The door of the operating room closed. The sound of the door closing seemed to hit Tang Yu's heart, and he couldn't calm down for a long time. He stood outside the door, feeling uneasy. This kind of anxiety and fear was something he had never felt before. His life had been smooth sailing, and he was sure of almost everything. He had never made a mistake. Even when Pei Chichi ran away from the marriage, he had been careful with every step and finally tied her to his arms. However, at this moment, he couldn't help her. He could only wait outside and watch his Chichi suffer. He said that the child could be saved, but he couldn't guarantee it. He just wanted her to be more confident and stronger. His Chichi had always been strong. Tang Yu held his forehead with his fingers and looked up. His eyes were warm. Lin Yun, Zhao Yi, Grandpa Shen, and even Tang Jiyuan were here. "What's going on?" Lin Yun walked over quickly and asked. Tang Yu wiped his face with his palm. Maybe Pei Huan's fans did it. But I'm not sure, we still need to investigate. Lin Yun paused, then said angrily, this Pei Huan really doesn't know when to stop. Hasn't Chichi suffered a lot from her? What's the point of harming yourself and others like this? Old Master Lin was also quite furious. He knocked on his walking stick. If it was really Pei Huan who attracted it, he would chop Pei Huan into pieces. Tang Yu's heart was a little confused, but he still talked about the matter and kept a clear mind. This can't be concluded so quickly. I don't think it's that simple. If she was really a fan, shouldn't she protect her idol? Why would she bring trouble on herself? However, Tang Yu couldn't care so much now. The most important thing was the safety of Chichi and the child. As for the person behind the scenes, he had to find out. He couldn't let a time bomb stay by Chichi's side. Lin Yun nodded. We'll see when Chichi and her child are safe. She was a Buddhist. At this moment, she closed her eyes and sincerely prayed to Buddha for Pei Chichi. Zhao Yi helped her sit to the side, and his careful look made Tang Jiyuan look sideways. At this time, other people were worried about her, but he saw it clearly. Chapter 683. Time passed, minute by minute, second by second. Every second was unbearable for Tang Yu. His heart ached. His Chichi was so afraid of pain. She was even afraid of blood. Now that she had lost so much blood, was she afraid? His eyes were a little red. He touched his pocket for a long time before remembering that he had quit smoking a long time ago. Tang Jiyuan handed him a cigarette. Go and have a smoke. Tang Yu lit it and took a long drag. It seemed that he could calm down by doing this. After 2 long hours, the door of the operating room finally opened. Although Dr. Mai was tired, she walked quickly. Tang Yu immediately went up to her. He pursed his beautiful thin lips, but he couldn't ask. Mother and child are safe. Thank goodness. Dr. Mai took off her mask and smiled tiredly. At that moment, Tang Yu felt his body relax and the soles of his feet soften. Lin Yun was a woman after all, so she could make up her mind. Shui Xian, sorry to trouble you. When Chichi wakes up, we'll go and see her. She turned her body and kicked Tang Yu. Are you stupid? Tang Yu woke up and said in a dry voice, Aunt Mai, thank you. What are you thanking me for? Chichi is still very weak. Although the child is safe, she might have to be hospitalized for the first 6 months. She will have to be extra careful after that. The first child is always more precious. Dr. Mai put on her mask again. I'll go in first. I'm afraid that Tang Yu will be too worried. The door closed again. Tang Yu's eyes were slightly wet. Lin Yun glanced at him. Look at you. You're so calm in the face of danger, but now you're almost crying in the hospital. Although that was what she said, she still hugged him. How could she not know how Tang Yu felt? Back then, she had also lost a child. She thought that she would never be able to have another child, but she didn't expect, just now, Pei Chichi's unborn child might not be able to survive. In her mind, there was only worry, and not a trace of Zhao Ku. She thought that it was Tang Yu and Zhao Yi who made her let go of everything, and of course, the child in her belly. Lin Yun hugged Tang Yu softly. Tang Yu, you're going to be a big brother again. Even Tang Yu was stunned. He looked at his mother and didn't know what to feel. I think you've long passed the rebellious phase, so you won't mind too much. Lin Yun smiled and patted him. The incomparably noble Tang Yu was in an especially sorry state today. He was still a bit dazed, and it took him a long time to come back to his senses. He smiled bitterly and said, of course. Zhao Yi was smiling from the side. When Lin Yun returned to his side, he helped her sit down, extremely considerate. Just like that, Tang Jiyuan could only watch his Yun with another man. When they got married, he did not go. He was not generous enough to see her remarry while he still loved her. He didn't even know how many times he had drunkenly called her name. But she belonged to another man. Zhao Yi was a very considerate man. After weighing the pros and cons, he said to his wife gently, Yun, I'm going to buy some things from the supermarket across the street. Chichi will need them when she comes out later. Tang Yu probably didn't expect this at the moment. Sit down, I'll be there in a while. Chapter 684. Zhao Yi got up and patted Tang Yu. Take care of your mother too. Tang Yu understood and nodded. Grandpa Tang knew that everything was fine and went back. After Zhao Yi left, Tang Jiyuan slowly walked over and sat next to Lin Yun. After a while, he glanced at his charming ex-wife, touched his nose, and asked unhappily, "You're pregnant?" Lin Yun was a little surprised. She didn't expect Tang Jiyuan to see it. "Yun, you were like this when you were pregnant with Tang Yu. How could I not see it?" Tang Jiyuan smiled. He wanted to smoke but put it down because he was worried about Lin Yun. Lin Yun was speechless. If that was the case, how could he not see it when she was pregnant with that child? Lin Yun was a little emotional, but it was only a little. It had been so many years. Tang Jiyuan was snubbed. He gave Lin Yun a deep look and didn't say anything else. After a while, Zhao Yi came back with a big bag of daily necessities. Pei Chichi was pushed to the VIP ward. She still hadn't woken up. Lin Yun stood at the door and told Tang Yu something before leaving. Tang Jiyuan watched the couple leave and stood there for a long time. Then he patted Tang Yu's shoulder and said, "Take good care of her." Tang Yu nodded. "Don't tell Tang Xin yet." He didn't want Tang Xin to worry and also didn't want her to disturb Pei Chichi. After Tang Jiyuan left, Tang Yu closed the door and sat in front of the bed. Pei Chichi's eyes were closed. Her long and thick eyelashes were like two small fans on her face, which made her face look even paler. Tang Yu sat on the bed and reached out to brush away the hair on her forehead. He said in a hoarse voice, "Chichi." Her eyelashes trembled, but she still didn't wake up. Her little hand that was held by him was weak. His heart ached. She was as fragile as a child at this time. He bent down and hugged her, and the child very carefully. Dr. Mai had already changed out of her surgical gown and stood at the door with two nurses behind her. Dr. Mai's face was gentle. She had watched Tang Yu grow up. She had never seen him as fragile as he was now. The nurse glanced at Dr. Mai and said in a low voice, "She should be on an 4 drip." Dr. Mai made a sound of acknowledgement and walked in to personally help Pei Chichi with the drip. From today until tomorrow, he'll need a drip. He'll be much better after tomorrow afternoon. Dr. Mai paused for a moment. "Don't worry, this won't affect the child." She signaled the nurse to leave with her eyes. Then, she coughed lightly and said, "Don't have sex for 3 months." Tang Yu was a little surprised and looked at Dr. Mai. Dr. Mai put her hands inside her white coat and coughed again. "That's all. I'm going to have lunch first." Chichi would wake up in about 2 hours. At that time, he could eat liquid food appropriately. Tang Yu watched her leave and sat for a while before wringing a hot towel to wipe Pei Chichi's hands and face. Pei Chichi didn't wake up until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. When she slowly opened her eyes, she saw Tang Yu's slightly haggard face. He sat by the bed and leaned forward. His eyes were fixed on her. She tried hard to open her eyes and looked at him quietly. She gently moved her fingers and slowly caught one of his index fingers. Her little face was still pale as she held it. "Tang Yu, the child," she stared at him with her eyes that were like black grapes. She was afraid that she would miss a trace of his expression. Tang Yu felt sorry for her. He held her little hand tightly. "Chichi, the child is fine." Chapter 685. Tang Yu stepped forward and hugged her carefully. His warm breath enveloped her body. "Chichi, our child is still here." His voice and body were trembling. He closed his eyes and said, "I'm sorry. It was because he didn't take good care of her that she almost lost her child." Pei Chichi didn't move. She could feel his cautiousness and trembling. This was Tang Yu. How could he be so scared? The two of them didn't say anything and just hugged each other. At this moment, they both needed to feel each other's warmth. After a long time, he maintained this posture and said in a hoarse voice, "Chichi, are you hungry?" She nodded and looked around. Her eyes fell on his face again. "Tang Yu, did you not have lunch?" He didn't say anything. He got up and went to get a small bowl of millet porridge. He then shook her bed and fed her. She was still weak, so he held her head with one hand and fed her with the other. Pei Chichi rested her head on his shoulder. Her eyes were filled with his light blue shirt, which made her feel at ease. She cried out obediently and recovered some strength. His little hand gently stroked his lower abdomen. This child was really tenacious. She looked up at Tang Yu and said, "You eat some." Tang Yu finished the rest of her porridge, quickly packed up and accompanied her. He still had some lingering fear, but he didn't want to bring this negative emotion to her, so he didn't mention it. He didn't mention it, but Pei Chichi did. "Do you really think it was done by Pei Huan's fans?" Tang Yu reached out to wipe the sweat on her forehead and said hoarsely, "Don't you think so? Would Pei Huan have such loyal fans?" Pei Chichi looked at Tang Yu. "Have you guessed who did it?" He held her fingers, and there was an indescribable pain in his heart. Pei Chichi looked at him and didn't say anything else. She knew how he felt, and this kind of thing needed evidence. She couldn't be convicted based on guesses. Her body was weak, and after a short conversation, she fell asleep in exhaustion. Tang Yu kept watching until evening. Meng Qingcheng came over, but he didn't come in. Tang Yu covered Pei Chichi with the quilt, walked out and closed the door carefully. "How is the girl?" Tang Yu asked. Meng Qingcheng took out a cigarette and gave it to Tang Yu, but Tang Yu didn't take it and looked at him. Meng Qingcheng scratched his head and coughed. "Tang Yu, be ready." Tang Yu's brows furrowed slightly as he listened to Meng Qingcheng quickly say, "After coming out of the hospital's operating theater, the girl jumped off the building. It was probably because she was disfigured." Tang Yu's gaze looked straight into Meng Qingcheng's eyes. Meng Qingcheng smiled bitterly. Tang Yu said slowly, "Or maybe, it's because of the person behind her." As he said this, Meng Qingcheng was speechless. After a long time, he sighed. "I didn't expect it." Tang Yu's face was a little tense and he put his hand in his pocket. "Qingcheng, do you have a cigarette?" Meng Qingcheng looked at him. He said he wouldn't smoke just now. He still offered a cigarette. Tang Yu walked to the smoking area with him and let out a long puff of smoke. "Qingcheng, no matter how well I treat Chichi, I'm the one who harmed her this time." They both knew who did it. Chapter 686. Meng Qingcheng nodded and suddenly asked, "Tang Yu, if we find out that she did it, what will you do? Send her to jail?" Tang Yu's gaze was calm. Although he didn't say a word, Meng Qingcheng already understood what he meant. He paused and said, "With Shen Zhongshan's current situation, only Shen Lian can support Jin Taihe." Tang Yu's black eyes were cold. "What does this have to do with me? If she did it, then Shen Lian would have to pay the price." Meng Qingcheng nodded. "Okay, if necessary, I will look for King to see if there are any relevant clues." However, what they thought, the person behind it also thought. All the clues were clean, and the source of the call on the phone of the girl who jumped off the building couldn't be found. The director of a bureau in B City personally came to apologize to Tang Yu for his incompetence. Tang Yu met him outside. After listening, he silently finished smoking the cigarette in his hand and said lightly, "This matter ends here." He wouldn't be able to find anything if he continued to investigate, and he had his own way. The director of B City wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and left. When Tang Yu returned to the ward, Pei Chichi was leaning against the headboard and reading lazily. Seeing him come in, she looked up. "Who's here?" Tang Yu slowly closed the door and paused. "A senior in the company." Pei Chichi replied with an "oh" and didn't say anything else. Her gaze was still on the fairy tale book in her hand. Her face was quiet and beautiful, and there was some color in it. Compared to her pale face a week ago, she was a little rounder. Tang Yu walked over and sat down. He reached out to touch her little face and smiled. "How is the child?" Pei Chichi put down the book in her hand and looked down at her belly. Then, she smiled. "It's fine." As she said that, she sat up straight and hugged his arm. "Tang Yu, when are we going home?" She was going moldy after living here for a week. Tang Yu turned his head to look at her lively little face. He smiled faintly and asked casually, "Isn't it good to live here?" She frowned. "Oh no. It smells like disinfectant. I don't like it, and neither does the baby." Her little face rested on his shoulder, her black eyes blinking as she stared at him. Just by looking at her, his heart was about to melt. Tang Yu reached out to touch his chin and looked at her. But Auntie Mai said to stay for at least a month to protect the baby. "Tang Yu, can you tell Auntie Mai that I'm going home? I promise I won't run around and I'll stay in bed." Her eyes were bright and lively. Tang Yu stared at her and said slowly, "Why should I tell Aunt Mai?" Pei Chichi looked surprised. "Don't you love me very much? Didn't you say that I would agree to everything? You also know that I love you?" he asked and reached out to knock her little head. "Then you shouldn't have made such a request." Pei Chichi looked at him. She wasn't afraid of him at all. "Mr. Tang, a kiss." He looked at her. "Mrs. Tang, do you want to get rid of me with a kiss?" As he said that, he reached out and held her in his arms. He was so close that she could also feel his excitement. Shameless. Her little face rested on his shoulder. She was a little shy, and her little hand gently touched the side of his shoulder. Tang Yu kissed her and didn't let go of her, nor did he go further. Chapter 687. But the little mischievous girl kept poking him and hugging his neck. Her voice was especially soft. "Tang Yu, are you feeling terrible?" His face darkened as he stared at her. "Pei Chichi, what do you think?" Since she was recuperating, he had no choice but to recuperate. She hugged him and giggled. Tang Yu gently patted her twice and said helplessly, "You're already so old, but you're still like a child." He wanted to tell her to get down, but she clung to him and refused to let go. "Chichi." He called her name, then brushed aside her crazy little hair, revealing her jade-white face, and kissed her deeply. Her little hands clutched his shirt as she accepted his kiss. His kiss was restrained yet affectionate. His whole body was taut and powerful. Her little hands caressed his back. She was soft in his arms, like a puddle of water. After a long time, he finally let go of her with great difficulty. "Chichi, do you want me to kiss you?" His fingers gently caressed her rosy little mouth, letting her nestle in his arms. Just hugging her like this, his heart was incomparably satisfied. She was still a little absent-minded. Her small mouth was slightly open, and her eyes were misty. She was indescribably seductive. Tang Yu was so aroused that he could not help but kiss her again. It was a lingering kiss, as if he had the rest of his life to kiss her like this. In the end, he was still interrupted. The nurse stood at the door helplessly because Mr. Tang was kissing Mrs. Tang. Mrs. Tang was pressed down on the bed, and Mr. Tang was propped up on top of her. Even though he was wearing a shirt, his muscles could still be seen. It was the kind where they kissed while doing push-ups. How embarrassing. The nurse covered her overheated face and said softly, "Mr. Tang, Miss Pei wants to see Mrs. Tang. She says she's Mrs. Tang's younger sister." Mr. Tang was playing with Mrs. Tang. When he heard the voice, his body stiffened. Then he turned over and frowned. "Sister." Before the nurse could say anything, Pei Huan had already walked out from behind. "It's me." Tang Yu's gaze was profound, and the nurse quickly retreated. When Pei Chichi heard the voice, she could tell that it was Pei Huan. She did not expect Pei Huan to come. Tang Yu tilted his head and asked gently, "Do you want to see him?" "Let's meet." Pei Chichi sat down and tidied her hair. Pei Huan walked in and saw the messy bed. She roughly knew what they had been doing. Pei Huan chuckled twice and said with a fake smile, "You look like you're in a good mood. Did I interrupt something?" Tang Yu only glanced at her, and she shut up, not daring to mention it again. Pei Chichi leaned against the headboard and didn't exchange pleasantries with Pei Huan. She asked directly, "What brings you here?" Pei Huan did not say yes, nor did she say no. She looked at Pei Chichi up and down. Her complexion was good, and she was still in the mood to play just now. The child was still there. Nothing. "I just came to see how you are." Pei Huan walked to the sofa opposite the bed and sat down. After sitting for a while, she smiled. This sofa is really nice. And this ward is even bigger and more luxurious than the apartment. Pei Chichi kept looking at her without saying anything, waiting for Pei Huan to get to the point. She could tell that Pei Huan was bluffing. Usually, people who dealt with bad things would act like this. Pei Huan took out a cigarette from her bag. She was about to smoke, but then she put it back. Chapter 688. I know. Pei Chichi's voice was indifferent. Pei Huan was stunned. She couldn't believe that Pei Chichi believed her just like that. She looked embarrassed and said, "She's not my fan either. I don't have such an extreme fan." Or rather, she didn't have any fans at all. Thinking of this, Pei Huan's eyes turned vicious. That bitch must have framed me. Pei Chichi knew that the reason why Pei Huan kept herself clean was that she was afraid that Tang Yu would take revenge on her. She smiled and said, "That girl jumped off the building. There's no evidence. Whether she's your fan or not, I don't think you did it." Tang Yu was slightly touched as he listened. There were some things that he didn't tell Chichi, but she knew about it. And that person, he couldn't find any evidence against her, but he didn't do nothing. He wanted to ensure the safety of his Chichi. He believed that it wouldn't be long before that person couldn't hold back. Pei Huan was in disbelief when he heard Pei Chichi's words. If she were Pei Chichi, she would take the opportunity to blame everything on her. Pei Huan stared at Pei Chichi and said, "Don't think that I will be grateful to you because of your fake kindness. I told you that no one wants your gratitude." Pei Chichi smiled and looked out of the window. She said softly, "Pei Huan, I think if Dad could feel it, he would want you to live a good life." Having said that, she fixed her eyes on Pei Huan's face. Pei Huan's lips trembled and the expression on her face was twisted. She couldn't say a word for a long time. After a long time, she said, "Pei Chichi, give the company back to me before you talk about Dad." Pei Chichi sighed and said, "Pei Huan, will you run the company well?" Pei Huan stared at her. "I can give it to you, but you have to grow up first." Pei Chichi said calmly. And what Pei Huan hated the most was Pei Chichi's dogmatic way of speaking. She picked up her bag and said, "I'm leaving. It's fine as long as it has nothing to do with me." "You were the one who said it, Pei Chichi. It has nothing to do with me. Don't blame me for anything that happens in the future." Pei Chichi sat down. "You didn't do it, so you don't have to be afraid." Pei Huan gritted her teeth and went out. She suddenly turned around at the door. She looked at Pei Chichi, looked at Pei Chichi's bulging belly, and then looked at Tang Yu. She was a little envious and jealous, but she also knew that it was her own doing. She watched for a while before pursing her lips and walking out. Tang Yu was still leaning on the side. Pei Chichi looked up at him. "Actually, Pei Huan is quite pitiful. Why are you sympathizing with her again? I never knew that Boss Pei could be so soft-hearted." He went over and hugged her. "Don't think about it. Maybe she will grow up in the future." Pei Chichi tugged at his sleeve and looked a little worried. "Tang Yu, you don't know. I'm most afraid that she will get addicted to that drug. It will destroy her." Pei Huan was young and beautiful now. A lot of men wanted her and she could earn money. But what about the future? What would she do in the future? If Pei Huan didn't hate her, she would have sent Pei Huan to the drug rehabilitation center immediately. However, as Pei Huan said, Pei Chichi was not a saint, and she was not a fool. What she did was not good for her or Pei Huan. Pei Huan would have the rebellious mentality and think that she was hurting herself. Chapter 689. Tang Yu rubbed her fluffy hair and sighed. "Our Chichi's heart softened after she got pregnant. It's not that." She raised her head and hugged his waist. "Tang Yu, haven't you noticed that Pei Huan has changed?" Although his attitude was almost as bad as before, Pei Chichi and Pei Huan had grown up together. How could she not feel Pei Huan's change? Mr. Tang's answer was, "I don't pay attention to her." Pei Chichi looked at him. Tang Yu smiled. "Mrs. Tang, it's time for nap." He gently held her under the quilt and kissed her forehead. "The baby needs to sleep too." Pei Chichi grabbed his arm. It was rare for her to be disobedient. You haven't agreed to what we just talked about. And he had kissed her. Mr. Tang immediately put on a superior attitude and looked at her. Pei Chichi, when did I agree? Pei Chichi was furious. She grabbed his hand and bit it. Then why did you kiss me? He let her bite his hand. When she left a bite mark, he chuckled and said, Mrs. Tang, should I let you kiss me back? Profiteer. Pei Chichi let go of him and rolled to the other side with the blanket. Looking from the back, they were all angry. But she was so cute when she was angry. Tang Yu smiled and covered her with the blanket. He turned over to the sofa and turned on his laptop. These days, he had been dealing with business in the hospital. When Chichi was asleep, he would take time to read documents. She said that she wanted to move back. He wanted her to live more comfortably, but he didn't dare to take risks. He was afraid that something would go wrong. Although it was a little annoying to coax her like this, Tang Yu also enjoyed it. Later on, when her body became stronger, he pushed her around the hospital. Of course, at this moment, Tang Yu hired 4 bodyguards. They were all very skilled. Once they left the room, they would follow Pei Chichi around the clock, especially when he was occasionally not around. Pei Chichi thought he was making a mountain out of a molehill, but Tang Yu didn't want her to know how panicked he was when he saw the blood on her dress. He was afraid of losing her, and he was afraid of losing the baby. He couldn't take another scare like this. In the afternoon, after Pei Chichi took a nap, Tang Yu took her for a walk on the lawn outside. He had just received a call. About 10 steps away, Pei Chichi was sitting on a lounge chair, looking at the artificial lake across from her. With 4 bodyguards by her side, Pei Chichi only felt that it was a dark mass, and all the scenery was tasteless. From afar, she saw 2 nurses pushing Shen Zhongshan over. Pei Chichi watched them quietly until they were in front of her. Is he still the same? There's no improvement at all? Pei Chichi asked softly. The nurse nodded. Yes, he's still the same. The nurse was nice to Shen Zhongshan. She squatted down and coaxed him. Shen Zhongshan's gaze was fixed on Pei Chichi, and he squeezed out a stiff voice, little sister. Pei Chichi's heart was in a mess. Mrs. Tang, please don't mind him. Mr. Shen is like this now. The nurse sighed. He's like an old child. Pei Chichi replied casually, but her eyes fell on Shen Zhongshan's neck. There was a faint bruise there. She looked at it, and the nurse also looked over. Then, her expression became a little strange. What's going on? Pei Chichi looked at the 2 nurses. They didn't seem to be cruel people. Chapter 690. The nurse hesitated for a long time. After all, Pei Chichi was Mrs. Tang, and Shengyuan Hospital belonged to Shengyuan Group. She thought for a while and told the truth. Actually, Miss Shen lost control and pinched me. Miss Shen looked so elegant, but she was so violent behind the scenes. It had happened a few times. She was normal when she came, but after she came, she had a weird expression on her face. They didn't dare to say anything. After all, it was a family matter. But it would be bad if something happened in the hospital. Pei Chichi was also stunned. She looked up at Tang Yu. Tang Yu's face was cold. He stood straight, as if he didn't find it strange. Pei Chichi looked at Shen Zhongshan again. She touched the bruise with her finger, feeling sad. What kind of conflict did he have to hurt her father? Does it still hurt? She asked Shen Zhongshan softly. But Shen Zhongshan didn't know. He repeated it as usual. Miss Pei Chichi's eyes were a little wet. She had seen the man in front of her several times. He was unfamiliar and distant. She didn't expect that one day, they would meet in such a way. She nodded. Miss, let me treat you to some delicious ice cream, okay? In their eyes, Shen Zhongshan was pitiful and pitiful. But maybe he was happy in his own world. If he couldn't be happy, then he didn't know about those ugly things. What was wrong with staying in his own world? Pei Chichi would rather not disturb him. Shen Zhongshan stared at her little face. After a long time, he clapped his hands. Eat. Then, a string of saliva dripped from the corner of his mouth. Pei Chichi's heart ached. This was Shen Zhongshan, the leading figure of B City. She ordered a bodyguard to buy an ice cream. It didn't need to be too big, but it had to be delicious. Shen Zhongshan was already drooling after he said that. Pei Chichi wiped the saliva away for him patiently. But then, another string of saliva dripped down. Be a good boy. Let me wipe it away for you. Pei Chichi was full of patience. It was probably because she was going to be a little mother that her whole body exuded love, and her whole person was unbelievably gentle. Tang Yu, who was at the side, finished the call and looked over. He wore a pair of white casual pants with a light blue shirt on top. Neat and tidy, he looked incomparably elegant. Holding his phone, he looked at the most important woman in his life, watching her wipe away Shen Zhongshan's saliva. Somehow, he felt that his Chichi was a little different. She had become calm and composed, not as sharp as before. His gaze was gentle. After looking at her for a long time, he raised his eyes and saw Mrs. Shen walking over. Tang Yu greeted her. Mrs. Shen's gaze was a little blank. Something was not right. The young nurse whispered, after Mr. Shen was hospitalized, Mrs. Shen was different from before. Sometimes, she would be absent-minded. It looked like she had suffered a blow. Pei Chichi didn't say anything. She looked up at Tang Yu. Tang Yu pulled her over and pulled her body into his embrace, hugging her tightly. Mrs. Shen was squatting, wiping away Shen Zhongshan's sweat carefully and attentively. Pei Chichi looked at her with hot eyes and said in a low voice, she must love him very much. Tang Yu sighed in his heart and reached out to touch the little guy in his arms. Sometimes, one-sided love was not enough. Shen Zhongshan didn't love Mrs. Shen. At least, that was what Tang Yu thought. All these years, although Shen Zhongshan wasn't like Tang Jiyuan, he had many affairs. Chapter 691. Mrs. Shen also noticed the bruises on Shen Zhongshan's neck. She stared blankly at him, muttering to herself, that bastard. That bastard. Tang Yu clenched his fists as he watched Mrs. Shen carefully caress Shen Zhongshan's neck. Then, she took out a box of medicine from her bag and carefully applied it for him. Mrs. Shen knew that Shen Lian had done it. So, what did Shen Zhongshan's sudden dementia have to do with Shen Lian? Tang Yu pursed his lips. Mrs. Shen did not speak to them, as if they did not exist. After a while, she pushed him away. Tang Yu, aren't you going to ask? Pei Chichi tugged at his sleeve. Tang Yu lowered his head to look at her and smiled faintly. Mrs. Tang, you don't like me asking about my ex-girlfriend? That's different. Pei Chichi looked at the back view of Mrs. Shen pushing Shen Zhongshan in the distance and said pitifully, I feel a little sad when I see it. If Shen Lian had been the one who had splashed her with acid and Shen Zhongshan, then Shen Lian was not far from losing her mind. Tang Yu grunted and said softly, Chichi, we won't be like this. He would take good care of her. Forever, he would only have her. The bodyguard bought the ice cream, but Shen Zhongshan had already left. Pei Chichi looked down and then looked up at Tang Yu. Eat it. Tang Yu refused. Pei Chichi, I'm not a child. Pei Chichi insisted. But sometimes you are a child. For example, she glanced at him. As a man, as Pei Chichi's man, Tang Yu immediately understood. There was no one around. He lowered his voice and said, Chichi, are you talking about when I eat you? Pei Chichi blushed and stuffed the ice cream into his hand. Eat it. Tang Yu took it and felt much better. In fact, his Chichi wasn't that dumb. He chased after her and grabbed her hand. His voice was filled with adoration and adoration. You're walking so fast. You should be more careful. Oh, she replied and slowed down obediently. Then she bit her lip and said, Tang Yu, the baby kicked me again. Her brows were furrowed and her watery eyes were brimming with tears. She grabbed his hand again. Her long hair was let loose, and her features were exquisite. She didn't look like a mother at all. Without looking at her belly, she looked like a little girl. Tang Yu's heart softened. He squatted down and put his face on her bulging belly. He felt the little hands and feet wriggling inside. His emotions were a little stirred. Life was really magical. He put his finger on her lower abdomen and greeted the little guy inside with a smile. "Hi, I'm Daddy. Be nice to Mommy and don't bully her. Otherwise, I'll spank your little butt when you come out." Pei Chichi played with his black hair with her fingers. "You're so small. How can you understand?" At this moment, Tang Yu was no longer the noble and aloof president of Shengyuan, but her husband. There was no sense of distance between them. Just as he said, he wasn't a god. Tang Yu was just an ordinary man. In front of her, he was just an ordinary, sexy, and charming man. He wasn't omnipotent, but he was really good to her. Chapter 692. He patted her butt. "Naughty." Pei Chichi giggled and hugged him tightly. "Tang Yu, how can I be so happy?" Mr. Tang stood up and pinched his little face. He coughed and said, "Miss Pei, I can only say that you slept with the right person." She glared at him. Tang Yu looked at her and said, "Weren't you the one who entered my room? Weren't you the one who touched me and kissed me?" He was putting on a high profile again. Whenever Mr. Tang wanted to bully her, he would show such an expression. Pei Chichi had fallen for it before, but now she was being naughty. She hugged him shamelessly and said, "No, it was you who couldn't resist the temptation." She hugged him with her belly between them. It was a little funny. Tang Yu put his finger on it and smiled. "When the baby comes out, I'll let you know whether I can resist the temptation or not." Pei Chichi could imagine countless scenes just by listening to it in the bathroom, on the sofa, on the bedroom floor, and even in front of the mirror in the changing room. It was very creepy. She hugged him tightly and said, "No. Then let me seduce our baby, okay?" He said it close to her little ear. After saying that, he found that her ears were red. He rubbed them and smiled. In the afternoon, when Pei Chichi was taking a nap, Tang Yu went out for a while. He knew that Mrs. Shun was now living in another house of the Shun family. As for the reason, it was probably the same as what he saw today. The doorbell rang a few times and a servant came to open the door. She didn't seem surprised to see Tang Yu and said that Mrs. Shun had been waiting for a while. Tang Yu walked in and saw Mrs. Shun sitting on the sofa in silence. She looked a little solemn. "Aunt Shun." Tang Yu sat opposite her and the servant poured him a cup of tea. Mrs. Shun looked up. It had only been half a month since they last saw each other, but her face was already full of vicissitudes. Mrs. Shun's voice was calm. "I know what you want to ask, Tang Yu." "I don't know anything, and I won't say anything." Tang Yu looked into Mrs. Shun's eyes and saw a mass of dead ash. There was not a single ray of light, not a single ray of hope. "Aunt Shun." Tang Yu's voice was a little strained. When he was 20 years old, he was facing a group of blonde and blue-eyed foreigners on a high-level international negotiation table. Even then, it wasn't so difficult. Because he could tell what those people wanted. Those people had a vision. But Mrs. Shun did not. In her world, there was only the Shun family and Shun Zhongshan. Now, there was no hope at all. Tang Yu could not convince her. Without Shun Zhongshan, Mrs. Shun would not betray her daughter. Tang Yu felt that he had come to the wrong place. "I will find an American expert for Uncle Shun." He stood up and paused for a moment. "Aunt Shun, Jinrong is awake. I believe that one day, a miracle will happen to Uncle Shun." Mrs. Shun's gaze fell on Tang Yu's face. After a long time, a glimmer of hope flashed in her pair of eyes that had aged a lot. But soon, that glimmer of hope was extinguished. She kept looking at Tang Yu. Tang Yu sighed in his heart. At this moment, his phone rang. Before he could answer, the door opened. It was Shun Lian who appeared at the door. Her expression was flustered and her hair was a little messy. Her gaze swept between Tang Yu and her mother. Chapter 693. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at the untouched cup of tea on the table. He smiled faintly. "I'm here to see Auntie Shun. You can ask me anything." Shun Lian's voice was a little tense as she looked at Tang Yu. "Let's go out for a cup of coffee." Tang Yu nodded at Mrs. Shun and went out with Shen Lian. When they were outside, Shen Lian couldn't hold it in anymore. She sounded flustered and exasperated. Tang Yu, why did you get people to spy on me? No, that was no longer spying on her. It was watching over her. No matter where she went, there would be 8 bodyguards watching over her and following her wherever she went. Other than her house and when she went to the toilet, the 8 of them were inseparable like ghosts. She was going crazy. Tang Yu stood in front of the black sports car and took out a cigarette from his pocket. He was addicted to smoking again recently. He took it out and lit it. Shen Lian, do you have any evidence that I did it? Just like how he couldn't find any evidence that she had done anything to Chichi and Shen Zhongshan. Shen Lian's eyes narrowed. She glared at him and saw the 8 people around her. She held her head and screamed, Tang Yu, get them to leave. Leave. He was still calm and collected, calmly smoking his cigarette. I told you to leave, did you hear me? Shen Lian was panting. She felt like she couldn't breathe. Even when she went to the toilet, there were 8 men guarding outside. They looked at her as if she was a monster. Shen Lian found it difficult to breathe. Even when she turned off the lights at night, she still felt that there were 8 pairs of eyes staring at her in the dark. Her hair stood on end. Tang Yu looked at her and put out the cigarette in his hand. He sneered. Shen Lian, when you were doing this, did it ever cross your mind that he was your father? Maybe the law will punish you, but human nature will. In the dead of night, aren't you afraid? Don't you tremble when you look into his eyes? Shen Lian's pupils contracted. She looked at Tang Yu with a judgmental gaze. What did he know? Did he know everything she had done to Shen Zhongshan, or did he know about Pei Chichi's parentage? After a long time, she sneered, what makes you think that? Tang Yu didn't say anything. He just opened the car door and left. Shen Lian watched him leave in a daze. She didn't expect him to give up so easily. She chased after his car and screamed crazily, get them out of the way. Tang Yu, do you hear me? However, he drove very fast, and soon, she couldn't see his car anymore. Shen Lian watched from afar as her body slid down. Why? Why do you have to be so heartless to me? She slid down and sat on the ground in her high-end suit. She had no family, no Tang Yu, and even no freedom. What use did she have for that lousy company? Shen Lian's face was filled with tears as she murmured, Tang Yu, all of this is for you. But you. Why don't you want me? What's so good about Pei Chichi? The 8 men stood behind her, still like phantoms, watching her with cold eyes. They were from the special forces and weren't very sensitive to emotions. Shen Lian suddenly turned around and glared at them. She said fiercely, go away, you bastards, bastards. What right did they have to watch over her like that? Chapter 694. When Tang Yu returned to the hospital, the room was quiet. Pei Chichi was still asleep, lying on her side on the white hospital bed. Her black hair was spread across the pillow, and her little face was fair and adorable. Tang Yu walked in slowly. His originally dark thoughts were slowly being washed away. Seeing her, all the darkness seemed to have been driven away. He was afraid of losing her, so he had to be sure. Before finding out the truth, the most important thing for him was to protect Chichi from harm. Moreover, Chichi had promised not to go to the company and would stay at home to recuperate. Pei Chichi woke up and opened her eyes. She was still lying down and looking at him. Her voice sounded a little lazy after a nap. What's wrong? You don't look too good. Tang Yu smiled. Our Chichi knows how to care about people. He leaned against the headboard and she naturally buried her little face in his chest. She stretched out her arms and hugged him, yawning. Tang Yu, I still want to sleep. Tang Yu patted her little head. Chichi, sleep if you want to. I'll watch over you. After a while, her breathing became even. Tang Yu thought that she had fallen asleep and lowered his head to kiss her. Just then, Pei Chichi's voice sounded a little muffled. Where did you go just now? He laid down slowly with his forehead against hers and said softly, I went to see Mrs. Shun. She moved out. There was a hidden meaning in his words. Pei Chichi opened her eyes and looked at him. Tang Yu only wanted her to know what he wanted her to know. As for the rest, he would not tell her if it was not necessary. In her heart, Pei Ming was the perfect father, so she always kept that wonderful impression in her heart. Pei Chichi looked at him for a long time before she said softly, "What should we do then?" Mrs. Shen doesn't want to say. There's nothing we can do for now. Tang Yu reached out and pushed her hair aside. Chichi, do you want me to use the same method to deal with Shen Lian? She shook her head and buried her face in his chest. How could she? Shen Lian was crazy, but she wasn't. Tang Yu held Pei Chichi in his arms. What he didn't tell Pei Chichi was that the reason why he hadn't really touched Shen Lian was because he was suspicious of something. This made him indecisive. But in the end, his decision became the last straw to clutch at. A month later, Pei Chichi was released from prison. Her belly was also bigger. When she returned to the rose garden, it was already autumn. The baby was almost 6 months old. After staying in the hospital for a month, her lower abdomen was as round as a balloon. If she had not known beforehand, she would have thought that there were 2 babies inside. Dr. Mai had revealed that it was a girl. The happiest person in the Tang and Lin families was Old Master Lin. Old Master Lin didn't have any girls in his grandchildren's generation. He was used to seeing rough skin and flesh. The thought of giving birth to a girl as beautiful as Pei Chichi made him excited. However, Old Master Lin was very reserved. When others said that he was happy, he would curl his beard and wave his hand. It's just a girl. What's there to be happy about? However, he was secretly happy, especially when he looked at Tang Yu's little wife. Looking at her skin and flesh, he couldn't help but feel happy. She was so beautiful, and with Tang Yu's excellent genes, she was the crystallization of beauty and wisdom. Old Master Lin happily finished his visit and took a car back. It was already 9 o'clock at night. Pei Chichi leaned against the headboard and watched Tang Yu handle business. He was really working hard. He had to take care of her and manage a few companies at the same time. Chapter 695. Shengyuan Group and Marvel Genrome Group couldn't be taken over for the time being, so he had to manage it. Tang Yu, do you want to take a break? Pei Chichi came over and hugged him from behind, murmuring, "Look at you. You've lost weight. Are you worried about me, Mrs. Tang?" Tang Yu was only wearing a shirt and trousers, sitting in front of the sofa and sorting out the documents he had just signed. He didn't even look up. Pei Xiaoqi nodded sincerely and snuggled in his arms again. She leaned over to kiss the corner of his mouth and said in a sweet voice with a hint of jealousy, "I heard that President Tang will have a romantic encounter in France this time." How could he not understand what she was referring to? For this trip to Paris, Jin Taiha's representative would also go, which meant that he would be meeting Shen Lian in France. "Mrs. Tang, do you want to go with me?" Tang Yu gently pulled her to the front and directly sat on his lap, hugging her as if she was a baby in the past. However, there were still some obstacles. After all, her belly was not small. "I'm not going." Pei Chichi's body was in his arms, her head against his chin, and her voice was very delicate. "I won't be the third wheel, Mr. Tang." Naughty. He knocked on her head. "Are you sure you don't want to go?" "I'm not going," Pei Xiaoqi said with a strong backbone. Then she put her arms around his neck and kissed the corner of his mouth, murmuring seductively, "Mr. Tang, aren't you happy about Mrs. Tang's trust?" Tang Yu accepted her soft kisses and let her tease him. His voice was low and husky. "Not that happy." She giggled and turned around to sit in his arms. Her little hand hung around his neck. "Why aren't you happy?" Tang Yu looked down at his little girl and then at the pile of documents. After a long struggle, he finally decided to accompany Mrs. Tang. He reached out to pick her up, walked to the king-sized bed, and carefully put her on it. He leaned over and kissed her, taking her little hand down as he kissed her. Pei Chichi retracted her hand. "Tang Yu." Her voice sounded weak and uneasy. She already regretted provoking him. "I know, Chichi. I know." He coaxed her. "Just one kiss. I just want to kiss you." their lips and teeth intertwined. His fingers forcefully brought her onto his belt. She bit her lips and glanced at him. That gaze was filled with an indescribable charm. Tang Yu chuckled. He leaned against her and hugged her. He whispered into her ear, "Mrs. Tang, should I leave some marks on your territory?" Pei Chichi looked at him eagerly. "How do I mark it?" "Then why don't I teach you?" The older brother, who was also her husband, taught her naughtily. The child learned it as soon as he learned it, and left a red mark on the old man's neck. Tang Yu looked at himself in the shower and frowned. Then he went back to the bedroom and put his hands in front of him like a superior. "Mrs. Tang, is marriage equal?" "Of course." Pei Chichi misunderstood. She did not feel any sense of crisis. Instead, she smiled and said, "Your money is my money." Tang Yu nodded. "That's right. So, you kissed me all over." "To be fair, I kissed you all over." Pei Chichi was stunned. Pei Chichi was stunned. Pei Chichi covered his face. "Tang Yu, you are so bad." Chapter 696. Everything was done carefully, for fear of hurting her. At first, he was joking. After all, he really wanted to tease her. But after that, everything changed. His breathing became rapid, and so did hers. Her little hand grabbed the bedsheets, and her voice was a little hoarse. "Tang Yu, are you done?" She was really scared and weak. She looked up at him, her eyes wet. Tang Yu kissed her desperately, as if his whole body was on fire. A man who had been intimate for a long time could not be solved by a kiss. But he was still worried about her pregnancy, so he held back no matter how uncomfortable it was. He turned to her side, hugged her, and kissed her ear comfortingly. "Be good. Don't be afraid." But that little person nestled in his chest, and after a while, she became a little restless and carefully crawled into the front of his bathrobe. Tang Yu held back for a while, but he still could not. He grabbed her little hand, and his voice was very hoarse. "Chichi, you are playing with fire." She said softly, "I am playing with Mr. Tang." He was amused and angry at the same time. After they got married, she was really not afraid of him anymore. "Chichi." He held her little face and looked at her seriously. Pei Chichi did not let him look. Her little face nestled in his shoulder, and she bit him little by little. They had been together for more than a year. How could he not feel the change in her? Although he was a little troubled, he still thought of a way to make his Chichi happy. Of course, he also forced her to make him happy. When Tang Yu left early in the morning, he did not wake her up. She was a little crazy the night before, and she was still sleeping like a little pig. Tang Yu bent down and reached out to wipe away the saliva at the corner of her mouth. Seriously, she was already so old and was about to be a mother, but she was still drooling. Thinking of this, his eyes were very gentle, and his eyes were full of love. When the noble Mr. Tang went downstairs, he gave a lot of instructions to the little helper at home. Even though he had already said it once, he still patiently repeated it this morning before he was relieved. Actually, how could he really be relieved? Xiao Ran was already waiting. She was not going this time. She was only here to pick up the documents. Tang Yu gave the documents to her, and then he took the car to the airport. On the private plane, Tang Yu was still facing a pile of documents, and he was still not paying attention. Meng Qingcheng came with him. "Are you still thinking about Pei Chichi?" Tang Yu glanced at him. "Mrs. Tang." Meng Qingcheng touched his nose. "I'm used to it. But if you're not pregnant, Pei Chichi really looks a little young. Standing next to you, you really feel like you're eating tender grass. Qingcheng, no one will think you're a mute even if you don't speak." Tang Yu flipped open the document and took a sip of the coffee beside him. Meng Qingcheng was sitting opposite him. After thinking about it, he couldn't help but say, "I received news that Shen Lian is also staying at the Hilton Hotel, and," he smiled meaningfully, "she is staying in the CEO's suite next to yours. Tang Yu, you can catch up." Tang Yu knew about this, but he did not take it seriously. If a man didn't think about other things, just like when Pei Huan ran into his room to take a bath, he didn't seem to be moved at all. He didn't have any physiological feelings either. Therefore, there was no need for Shen Lian to be like this. Tang Yu did not respond, and Meng Qingcheng suddenly felt a little bored. He got up and said, "Tang Yu, it is difficult to find some gossip and entertainment from you." Chapter 697. Tang Yu ignored him and continued to deal with his own business. After a while, he raised his hand to look at his watch and used the satellite phone to call Pei Chichi's number. It was nothing more than some common life knowledge, causing Meng Qingcheng to be stunned. When Tang Yu put down the phone, Meng Qingcheng swallowed hard. "Tang Yu, your Pei Chichi used to be able to take care of herself, right? Why was it that after marrying Tang Yu had to teach her the common knowledge of brushing her teeth every day?" Tang Yu put down the phone slowly and glanced at Meng Qingcheng. Then, he said slowly, "Qingcheng, you're not married and you're not going to be a father. You don't understand." Meng Qingcheng couldn't take it anymore. He asked the truth, "Tang Yu, you're Pei Chichi's father, right?" Although he was only 6 years older, Tang Yu was precocious. He was full of the aura of a mature elite. Perhaps he had a special fatherly love at home, that must be it. Look at him. He kept saying good girl and don't forget this and don't forget that. He was just like his mother, spoiling Pei Chichi like a child. Meng Qingcheng pounded his chest and stamped his feet. Tang Yu said calmly, "Pei Ming passed away. I'm Chichi's only relative. Male relative." Meng Qingcheng stared at him in a daze for a long time. Then, he asked, "Then do you role play?" He couldn't imagine it. Just thinking about it gave him a nosebleed. Tang Yu was such a decent person, but he was also such a pervert. Tang Yu ignored him. How could he reveal too much about the private matters between him and Pei Chichi? Chatting like this for a while diluted some of his feelings of longing. Speaking of which, it was a little funny. He had only been away for 2 hours, but he already missed his little fellow. It was probably the sequelae of being inseparable for a month. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Paris time, the private plane landed, and then took a car to the Hilton Hotel. Originally, Meng Qingcheng had booked a room for himself, but Tang Yu stopped him. "Qingcheng, stay with me." Meng Qingcheng looked at him with a very strange expression. After a while, he coughed lightly. "Tang Yu, if you have been too abstinent recently, I can help you think of a way. But I can't do it myself, I am a straight man." Tang Yu swiped his card and walked into the presidential suite. He turned around and said, "That's what I wanted to tell you." Meng Qingcheng touched his nose and followed him in. Actually, he was quite good-looking. This suite covered an area of about 800 square meters. It was divided into a master bedroom, a secondary bedroom, a children's room, a conference room, and a study. It was fully functional. Of course, it was also expensive, more than $30,000 a night. Meng Qingcheng put his luggage away and pulled his tie when he walked out. "I know, you want me to protect you." Tang Yu glanced at him and did not say anything. He just held the red wine in his hand and took a sip. Meng Qingcheng looked at him and teased, "It's not easy for a man to come out. A man without a wife by his side should be a bird released from the cage." As soon as he said that, he felt that his analogy was really too appropriate. Tang Yu, a bird released from the cage. This meeting was quite important, otherwise Tang Yu would not have come in person. It was not that he had to do anything special, but out of courtesy, he had to show his face. At the same time, Lei Group and Jin Taihe were also partners, and there would be a dinner party a week later. Tang Yu glanced at him and did not say anything, slowly tasting the wine. Chapter 698. Tang Yu glanced at him and didn't say anything, sipping his wine slowly. As expected, he saw Shen Lian at the meeting the next day, but he just glanced at her and didn't talk to her the whole time. What made Shen Lian want to vomit blood was that the 8 bodyguards were still following her even though she was in France. Those who didn't know better would think that she was being ostentatious. What was even more incomprehensible was that these 8 people could enter the headquarters of Lei as if they were in their own backyard. During the meeting, Shun Lian kept staring at Tang Yu, but the latter was indifferent. Meng Qingcheng was watching from the side. As a bystander, it was time for Shun Lian to let it go. Tang Yu and Pei Chichi were married and had a child. Tang Yu spoiled Pei Chichi so much that there probably wouldn't be a day when they would divorce. Shun Lian was rich, beautiful, and had a good figure. There were people chasing after her from City B to France. Why bother? After the meeting, Tang Yu turned down President Lei's invitation and returned to the hotel. He was still blocked by Shun Lian at the door of the suite. Tang Yu, ask them to leave. Shun Lian's voice was a little hoarse. Tang Yu didn't say a word. After a long time, he said slowly, Shun Lian, do you know what these 8 people are for? Shun Lian was stunned. Wasn't it to monitor them? Tang Yu pursed his thin lips. If something happens to Chichi one day, Shun Lian was even more stunned. If something happened to Pei Chichi, would these 8 people immediately deal with her in the same way? No, it's 100 times. Tang Yu didn't have the slightest expression. Shun Lian, that's enough. You've done enough. Then he opened the door and walked into the room, but Shun Lian was still in a daze. She was stunned. So she had been wrong all along. It turned out that those people had such an effect. She had thought too soft-hearted of Tang Yu. But why didn't he say it? Why did he say it now? She turned around and saw the 8 people standing behind her. She felt a chill down her spine. With trembling hands, she took out her mobile phone and typed quickly. She only wrote a few words, halt all operations. After writing these words, her body was trembling. She believed that as long as she did it, if anything happened to Pei Chichi, Tang Yu would blame it on her. Moreover, he would be 100 times more ruthless. Shun Lian bit her lip, her eyes filled with unwillingness. However, no matter how unwilling she was, she had no chance to get close to Tang Yu. She could only look at him from afar, watching him mature. Even standing in the middle of a group of Europeans, he was still dazzling and dazzling. Shun Lian squinted her eyes and just looked at it. As she looked, her eyes felt a little sore. She drank a lot of alcohol. In the past, he was hers. At that time, they were very close. Everyone said that they were a good match. Tang Yu also said that she was the prettiest girl in the world in a white dress. So many years of love couldn't compare to a few months of Pei Chichi. Was physical contact that important? So important that he fell in love with Pei Chichi so quickly. Shun Lian looked at Tang Yu and drank the red wine in her glass. She wore a white dress today. The front was very conservative, and the back was hollowed out, showing off her beautiful back. All the men present were secretly looking at her. But in her eyes, there was no one else but Tang Yu. She saw his sexy Adam's apple move when he raised his head to drink. She still remembered kissing him there many years ago. At that time, he was still very young and not as mature as he was now. Chapter 699. The nightlife in Paris was very rich, but Tang Yu was not in the mood to miss it. He would return to City B early the next morning, and he was eager to go home. He drank the last mouthful of wine and slowly walked out of the hall. The air outside was a little moist, and it was very beautiful with the night sky. He was not in the mood to appreciate it. He walked to the parking lot, and the driver opened the door for him. When he returned to the top floor of the Hilton Hotel, he was surprised to see Shun Lian. Although the 8 King Kongs were around, it did not stop Shun Lian from showing off her beauty. Shun Lian was obviously drunk. Her hand was on the wall, and her eyes were full of lust as she looked at Tang Yu. In her eyes, besides seduction, there was also provocation. No man could stand this. Not wanting and not daring to want were 2 different things. Tang Yu looked at Shun Lian quietly, and he opened the door, ready to go in. A slender and soft arm wrapped around him. Shun Lian hugged him from behind and murmured, "Tang Yu, hug me." She was behind him, and her hot face was pressed against his back. Her slender fingers were also moving upwards. "Let go." Tang Yu's voice was calm. "Be more self-conscious, Ms. Shun." He called her Ms. Shun. Shun Lian chuckled. She tilted her head and looked up at his side profile. I'm not Ms. Shen. No, Tang Yu, I'm not. I just want to go back to being the original Shen Lian. She was crying. Tang Yu, let's go back to the past. Let's pretend that nothing happened. Let's be together. There's no one else between us. There's no Qin Anlan, no Pei Chichi. Okay. He did not know how much she missed him, and how much she loved him. She was wrong. If she could do it all over again, she would not choose to sleep with Qin Anlan to test him. She would listen to him and be good. Tang Yu firmly broke away from Shen Lian and turned his head. His noble expression did not change at all because of her confession and contact. His gaze was calm. Shen Lian, it's been so many years. Why bother thinking about it? If you wanted to start over, why didn't you compensate Uncle Shen? Shen Lian shook her head gently, tears still on her face. She was indeed a woman with the appearance of a lotus. She was especially beautiful when she cried at this moment, giving off a delicate and touching feeling. However, Tang Yu was not moved at all. He only sighed in his heart. Many years ago, Shen Lian used to be beautiful. Or perhaps, he had let her down, he walked in firmly. Shen Lian called his name hoarsely behind him. Tang Yu, don't you love me anymore? He had walked out long ago, but she did not. She was still at the same spot, still remembering what he said in the past. Tang Yu, I want to forget too. I want to give up too. But I can't do it. Shen Lian had never been so humble in front of him before. She was almost begging him. After that, she dropped her gown on the ground. Her fair body was enough to make any man crazy and infatuated. She just stood there like that, not caring if the 8 men saw it or not. She only knew that she only had one chance. Because Tang Yu was at his softest now. If he wanted her, she would have a way to make him marry her. Her tears flowed, and her body glowed under the light. She was indeed beautiful. Tang Yu, look at me. Don't you feel anything? She kicked off her gown and walked toward him slowly. Every step he took was like a fatal temptation. Tang Yu stood there. He was a man, but she might be disappointed. Chapter 700. Finally, Shen Lian approached him. She looked at him and said, Tang Yu, take me. Her voice was weak but alluring. Tang Yu looked at her quietly and said calmly, put on your clothes. His voice sounded a little stern, or perhaps a little disappointed. After all, he and Shen Lian had a relationship when they were young. He didn't want her to become like this. Shen Lian didn't move. She looked at him and sneered, you don't dare to. Or you can't, or are you afraid that Pei Chichi will find out? Tang Yu paused for 2 seconds before he looked at her and said softly, Qing Cheng, please ask President Shen to leave. Meng Qing Cheng? Shen Lian was stunned. She didn't expect Meng Qing Cheng to be in this room. Meng Qing Cheng was different from the bodyguards. Although Meng Qing Cheng was only Tang Yu's personal assistant, this personal assistant was also a respected person in City B. Shen Lian couldn't lower herself in front of Meng Qing Cheng. At the same time, she also knew why Tang Yu wanted to stay in the same room with Meng Qing Cheng. It was to guard against her. Shen Lian tilted her head and her eyes were provocative. Tang Yu, I don't believe that you don't feel anything at all. Her fingers moved downwards, but she didn't succeed. Tang Yu grabbed her hand and said in a deep voice, Shen Lian, save some face for yourself. With that said, he pushed her away. Shen Lian was stunned. He was actually so indifferent. She knew that she was beautiful enough and seductive enough tonight. The perfume she wore tonight was specially made to charm men, but Tang Yu didn't have any feelings for her at all. Seeing her like this, Meng Qing Cheng sighed. She picked up Shen Lian's clothes from the ground and handed them to her. She touched her nose and said, the air conditioning is good. Don't catch a cold. Sigh, looking at Shen Lian's figure, I'm going to vomit blood. Even Tang Yu can resist it. Shen Lian hugged her gown, feeling extremely embarrassed. She had really made a big joke out of herself. Just as she was putting on her clothes with trembling hands, Tang Yu came out of the bedroom with his documents in his hand. His voice was a little anxious. Qing Cheng, stay here to deal with the aftermath. I need to return to B City immediately. Meng Qingcheng was dumbfounded. Could he have been scared off by Shen Lian? That's impossible. Tang Yu has seen all kinds of storms and waves. While he was dumbfounded, Tang Yu had already left. Meng Qingcheng raised his hand and said, "All right, he's gone. CEO Shen can leave now, right? Why don't we have a drink?" Shen Lian's answer was to throw a high-heeled shoe at his face. The white shoe slid down Meng Qingcheng's face. Meng Qingcheng was dumbfounded. With such a bad temper, it was no wonder that no man wanted her. Tang Yu didn't want her, and even Qin Anlan didn't want her. Shen Lian chased after him barefoot. When she reached the entrance of the hotel, Tang Yu was opening the car door and getting into the car. "Tang Yu." She quickly went over and grabbed his arm. "Don't go." She knew that he rushed back to B City for Pei Chichi. She wouldn't let him go. She wouldn't let him go. Tang Yu looked at Shen Lian coldly. "Let go." He pushed her away roughly, got into the car, closed the door, and started the car quickly. The car drove away like a streamline, and she stood there in tears. She couldn't make him stay, from body to soul. Shen Lian smiled with tears flowing down her face. She smiled softly. Something must have happened to that bitch, Pei Chichi. Otherwise, Tang Yu wouldn't have rushed back. In the night of Paris, Shen Lian lost herself. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.